mic out. Then we'll go to Michael on the video, and then we'll open it up. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute for our conference on prioritizing political prisoner advocacy across China. Thank you so much for joining for panel number 1, which is focused on political prisoners, both past and present. I'm truly honored to be able to host this conference, especially at such a time as this. And I want to offer a special thanks to the Public Interest Fellowship for funding this program here today. We are on the precipice of a summit meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping, where the US has not only the opportunity, but the imperative to raise the cases of individual political prisoners across China. The president has engaged in multiple negotiations on behalf of hostages as well as political prisoners and secured release in a variety of contexts, including the First Lady's efforts to bring home Ukrainian children from Russia, the return of Israeli hostages from Gaza, and the return of political prisoners and dissidents from Venezuela and Belarus. If the president goes to China and does not, at minimum, raise high-profile political prisoners by name and request their release, it will look like weakness. Ideally, the president would return from Beijing having secured the release of multiple high-profile political prisoners, including Hong Kong pro-democracy advocate and founder of Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, Chinese Christian pastor Ezra, and peaceful Uyghur doctor Gulshan Abbas, among others. At root, the timing is ripe to secure the release of political prisoners across China for 3 crucial reasons. First, there's political momentum. The president himself has committed multiple times to securing the release of Jimmy Lai, including raising him by name in the meetings in October between Trump and Xi on the sidelines of APEC. But it's not only the executive branch that's paying attention. Just last month, one of our panelists, Zeba Morat, was invited by Speaker of the House Mike Johnson to represent her mom, Gulshan Abbas, at the State of the Union, alongside of Claire Lai, Jimmy Lai's daughter. And members of Congress are devoting significant attention to the issue, including Ted Cruz's unanimously passed resolution on Pastor Jin, the House resolution that's been introduced on Jimmy Lai, and countless letters directed by Congress to the President and the Secretary of State urging for the release of political prisoners across China. The second reason why this moment is important is that we have actual leverage. China made a misstep last October when prior Trump-Xi meetings on the sidelines of APEC, the party threatened to restrict global exports on rare earth minerals. While that threat has since been walked back during the APEC meetings, the party had to give very little to make up for that significant misstep. As a sign of good faith, the CCP should release political prisoners. The third reason why this moment is incredibly important is that we have the potential for multiple bites at the apple. The summit starting on March 31st is the first of 4 speculated meetings between President Trump and Xi Jinping just this year. That means that each meeting is an opportunity to press for the release of and ultimately to bring home political prisoners. That there is political momentum, leverage, and multiple opportunities to press for political prisoners' release at the same time makes this an incredibly unique moment in history, and one that neither Congress nor the administration can afford to miss. The heart of this program today are the political prisoners and their families. It can at times be a lonely path to walk for many of the family members as they long to be reunited with their loved ones and make the brave decision to speak out on their behalf. The hope of their loved one's safe return is what keeps them going, but they cannot go at this journey alone. They need the help and support of every single person in this audience and beyond, as well as the US government to secure the release of their family members. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from family members of some of the highest priority political prisoners. This is an immense privilege for me, not only to host them here at the Hudson stage, but to call them my friends. We also have a former political prisoner from Canada, Michael Kovig, who will be joining us online to share about his own experience. And I purposefully included him in this program because Michael offers hope, because he was released. He has experienced freedom, and that gives us hope that we can see freedom for your family members as well. So I'm now going to turn to introducing our wonderful panelists that we have here today. First, we have Grace Jin Drexel, the daughter of Pastor Ezra Jin. Grace is the daughter of Pastor Ezra Jin, who is the founder of Zion Church, one of China's largest underground house church networks. In October 2025, Pastor Jin was arrested at his home in Beihai, Guangxi, as part of a sweeping crackdown on independent Christian worship that also targeted dozens of pastors and church members across China. Grace has since been a public advocate for her father's release and for countless others detained by the CCP for their faith in her role at Luke Alliance, which I have the privilege of serving on the board. Grace was previously a national security research analyst on a Senate leadership committee and a professional staff member at the Congressional Executive Commission on China. She holds a master's in human rights and transitional justice from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a BA in political science from UCLA. Next, we'll have Zeba Morat joining us. She's the daughter of Gulshan Abbas. Zeba is a Uyghur advocate working to raise international awareness about Uyghur political prisoners in Xinjiang, with a particular focus on the unjust imprisonment of her mother, Dr. Gulshan Abbas. In 2018, Dr. Abbas, a retired Uyghur medical doctor, was forcibly disappeared by Chinese authorities and later sentenced to 20 years in prison on unfounded terrorism-related charges. Since then, Zeba has shared her family's story with policymakers, human rights organizations, and international audiences, drawing attention to the broader human rights atrocities facing Uyghurs. She was recently invited as a guest, as I mentioned before, of U.S. Speaker Mike Johnson to attend the State of the Union address, spotlighting the ongoing plight of Uyghur political prisoners. We'll next turn to Galpu. Galpu currently lives in Chicago and works in finance. He is the son of Pastor Gao Chen-fu, founder of Light of Zion Church in Xi'an, China, and his wife, Peng Yu. And last but certainly not least, we'll have Michael Kovig joining us virtually online. Michael is the founder of Strategic Effects, a nonprofit research network. He's also the chief executive of the Kovig Group, a private consultancy, and a senior advisor for Asia for the International Crisis Group. He's a former Canadian diplomat who previously served in Ottawa at the United Nations and in China. His prior work has also included journalism, economic research, and providing strategy, communications, and change management expertise for the UN. He has a master's degree from Columbia University and is fluent in both French and Mandarin. Michael, of course, lived in China from 2014 to 2021. In 2018, he was wrongfully detained in Beijing by Chinese state security and held for 1,019 days as a political hostage in retaliation for Canada's arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on a U.S. extradition warrant. On September 24th, 2021, he was released after the United States reached a deferred prosecution agreement with Meng. He's now based in Europe, and he'll join us later online. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over, Grace, to you first to share about your dad, Pastor Jin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Hudson, for hosting this event. On October 10th, my father, Pastor Ezra Jin, was arrested by the Chinese authority along with 27 other pastors and church leaders of Zion Church. 18 total remain in prison today. This crackdown represents one of the largest takedown of an independent Christian congregation in China since the Cultural Revolution, a sweep that is so brazen it has drawn international condemnation. To understand why my father is in prison, you must understand that leadership in China has in recent years embarked on a systematic campaign to achieve total state control over religious life through what they call Sinicization of religion, officially framed as making religion more Chinese. However, the truth is, Sinicization is not about making religion more Chinese. It is repression, plain and simple. Christians in China have been Chinese for generations. We have used Chinese Bibles, sing indigenous hymns. Our leadership are all led by Chinese pastors. But beginning in 2018, a wave of persecution crackdown on all religion came under the auspices of Sinicization. This included removing of crosses, replacing them with portraits of Xi Jinping, switching out hymns with revolutionary party songs, rewriting sermons to align with socialist core values, shutting down or even leveling churches. This crackdown also targeted Uyghurs, especially Uyghurs in Western China, Buddhist and other religious groups. In the state-sanctioned churches, the CCP has control of everything including the most sacred decisions of the church. The party leadership decides who becomes a pastor and are in charge of the wages of the pastor. So you can imagine that they have tremendous control on who could be baptized, what kind of sermons you can preach, etc. My father founded Zion Church in 2007. In 2018, Zion Church also became a target because the church leadership refused the government's demand to install 23 facial recognition cameras to target and track the believers. In response, the police brutally seized the church building and imposed an exit ban on my father, forbidding him from leaving the country. Yet now, in 2025, a new and more severe persecution is underway. For my father's church, and for many churches across China. The arrest and the now detention of the 18 church leaders happened not because they were political, but because they wanted to be faithful to God's word and to serve the communities around them. They're not opposed to the Chinese government. They sought to enrich the society, simply wanted to be free from the control of the Chinese Communist Party, a self-identified atheist party, over the sacred decisions of the church. Like Christians everywhere, my father's church holds firm the belief that thou shalt have no other gods before me. My father is not a very confrontational person. He was firm in his convictions, but he was the gentlest of souls. Unlike the stereotypical Asian father, he was extremely warm and doted on me and my brothers. He would always give me a big hug and greet me dramatically and saying, "Oh, my beautiful daughter is here." And we would walk in the evenings, arms linked together in the park. And often we would watch the Korean singing competitions, and we would all cry together when a specific old song came on and everything. He was always patient, always kind, and always giving people grace. He had an incredible sense of humor and optimism, even in prison. My father is now in prison because he held firm in his faith, but because he also cared and loved for his community. But now we hear that the prisoners are made to sleep on cold floors without beds. They are subject to endless interrogation and sleep deprivation, and they do not have access to their doctor-prescribed medication. Many of them, including my father, have serious health concerns, and we are extremely concerned that they are growing worse under the prison conditions. Since I began advocating for my father and the other detained, we have also experienced transnational repression, and I'm sure many of us here today have also experienced similar things. I have heard that there is an Iranian idiom that you cannot shake awake someone who is pretending to be asleep. And when it comes to China, a lot of people seems to be pretending to be asleep. But I urge all of us here today to take courage and to use the voice and influence in whatever sphere you occupy. Speak the names of those detained, my father, Pastor Ezra Jin, Pastor Gao Yinjia, Pastor Wang Lin, Pastor Yin Huibin, many others who are detained for their leadership in Zion Church, as well as many others. Pastor Gao Quanfu, Light of Zion Church, Pastor Wang Yi of Early Rain Covenant Church, and many more. Call for the Chinese government to release all Zion Church leaders immediately and unconditionally. Do not accept China's trampling of the universal human rights with silence. If left unchecked, Beijing's wave of repression will reverberate around the world, threatening human rights and religious freedom for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. I feel like it's so helpful to hear the more personal elements, because I think a lot of times political prisoners can be kind of limited to just their name or even their religious affiliation or their ethnicity. But I think hearing those personal stories about how much your dad loves you and your brothers, I think is a reminder of what he's missing out on and why we have to keep pushing to try to get him free. So Thank you, and thank you for your call to action too. Zeba, I'll hand it over to you to talk about your mom.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. My mother, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, her last trip to the United States was 2016. My sister and I both are here, and my mother's 3 siblings. When she was here last time in the United States, I asked her to stay, not go back, because everybody's here, but she just was so determined that she would go back. And she'll come back because she has 10 years multiple entry U.S. visa. She left. And then we start hearing all about the mass arrest, persecution. But then, even then, nothing happened. She was just living her life as a grandma. We would talk every day. My sister had a baby in 2016. We would just communicate with her every day. And then 2018, September, I remember that day so vividly because I talked to her the night before. I was a new mom then. My baby was 3 months old, and I would talk to her before I go to bed and just telling her, I'm going to bed. I'll talk to you in the morning. Just usual daughter and mother talk. That was the last time I talked to her. The next day, on the way to work, I tried to call her. I messaged her. Nothing. She just vanished. And this disappearance came 6 days after her sister, Gulshan Abbas, spoke at this very stage about the persecution of Uyghurs. And the Chinese government took my mom as a retaliation. I was a new mom then, in 2018. My daughter is 7 years old now. And my sister was also a new mom. So being a new mom, raising a kid, and also looking for my own mom at time. For 2 years, we didn't know what happened to her. No news whatsoever. And then we found out from a third party that she was sentenced to 20 years in prison on the charges of terrorism-related charges. We're going on 8th year of her detention. I just wanted to share a little conversation I had with my daughter like a month ago. We were reading the book of the encyclopedia for the kids, and that has a page of family tree, mom's side, dad's side. And I was telling her about my husband's parents, and then when it comes to my parents, I was talking to her about my mom and my dad. And she looked at me and she's like, I saw it on your computer. Grandma Rushan, she calls my aunt Grandma too. So Grandma Rushan's holding Grandma Gulshan's photo, and the photo has let my sister go. What does that mean? And I didn't know what to tell her. The only thing I told her was, Grandma is very far away. We will get her. Grandma Rushan's trying, I'm trying. Mommy is going away for these meetings because I need to bring your grandma here. And the relief on her face, I can tell that she was looking at me. She's like, okay, I thought she's in jail or something. And that broke me. The hardest part of this whole journey was feeling that guilt and feeling that I couldn't help to ease that pain on my nieces and my own daughter. And just to keep going in the circles without making a significant progress. But the good thing also is that meeting so many wonderful people, so many friends that stand behind us to help us in any way they can. I know I couldn't do it without you. So I just wanted to say thank you too. The Chinese government is continuously inflicting pain on American citizens, not directly or physically, but psychologically by targeting our family members, just because they think they can, and because we fail to hold them accountable. My mom's case is a typical case of the transnational repression against a U.S. citizen. The Chinese government's apparent purpose of targeting my mom was not to simply punish her, but to silence and retaliate against her sister, Gulshan Abbas, an American citizen and Uyghur advocate in the United States. That means this case is not only a human rights abuse abroad, it is an attack on the ability of Americans to speak freely without their family members being taken hostage by a foreign government. I know that President Trump has taken interest on freeing political prisoners around the world. And then, he had brought some home. So I think it's time for President to speak up on behalf of these American families who bear the cost of Beijing's transnational repression and call for the release. Securing their release would send a message to Beijing that U.S. will not tolerate the Chinese government's attempt to intimidate American citizens or silence its critics within our borders. It's time for him to end the suffering of American families and unjustly detained Uyghur all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeba, for sharing about your mom, who is a wonderful person. I know you and I have said that one day she's going to be able to hug your daughter, and one day she's going to be home, just like we hope for Pastor Jin as well, and for Gao Chenfu and Peng Yu as well. But we just, look forward to that day. We don't lose hope for that happening, and we will continue to stand alongside of you in that. So thank you for your bravery and your outspokenness. Gao, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Yes, thank you. First, I want to say it's a privilege to be with everybody here, and then I want to thank Olivia and Hudson for giving us this opportunity to speak up. My father, Gao Chenfu, founded Light of Zion Church about 41 years ago. And then my mom, Peng Yu, has been a loyal pastor's wife ever since. So some of my dad's main callings from God, you mentioned this with Corey, with Grace. One of them is the Back to Jerusalem movement, so which is bringing the gospel from the east, which is China, and through all the Middle Eastern countries, all the way back to Jerusalem. So in 2008, my dad organized a group of church leaders across China. They went on a 2 months, maybe 45 days road trip, driving from Xi'an, which is where I was born, all the way to Zion, which is Israel. I think they had 4 to 6 SUVs or something, and then they made a 12-part documentary about it. It's called From Xi'an to Zion. Now, through his work with that movement, and he also became very passionate about reconnecting with the previous generations of really pioneers of Chinese pastors and missionaries on the missionary work they did on westward missionary work. So I was talking to Zeba, so my dad travels to Xinjiang quite often to spend time with the previous generations of pastors and to learn about their lives and experiences. So he travels to Israel quite often, travels to Xinjiang quite often, western part of China. So two of the parts are very sensitive to the Chinese government. So as a result, May last year, from his last trip back from Xinjiang, he got arrested on the same day he got back, May 17th, along with 11 others, church members, on the same day. And then a month later, June 8th, my mom also got arrested. So I haven't been talking to him ever since, and I can't believe it's been a year. But Zeba was saying, we're talking about it's been 8 years for her, and it's been a year for me. I can't even imagine. But sometimes it really is all a blur. They're both 68 years old, and at times like this, it really makes me kind of reflect on what my parents told me. And we had a brief conversation just a couple weeks ago with Olivia. My dad tells me 3 things. One is to pray, and second is to thank God, even though we're not worthy, and He's still not does not give up on us. He gives us his wisdom, his love, and his life. And then third one is obey, so blindly obey. He says to pray to God, to put the innocence of a child in your heart. So you can follow him like a lamb following the shepherd, like a son following his father. You want that type of simplicity and purity. And he said the third one being the hardest lesson he's ever had learned. Now, with that, I also want to share a little story that my dad shared many years ago. He only shared this once, and also today is my first time sharing this story. I thought I could tell this story to show what I believe what most Chinese Christians are like. So this was my freshman year in college, back home for summer break, and then just normal Sunday morning church service. And I remember seeing my dad up there. He said, I've never shared this story before, but today I feel the need to share the story. He said a few years ago, so this was probably like the late 90s, and I was just an early teenager. He was probably late 30s, maybe 40. He said a few years ago, one morning, my son went to school, my wife went to work. I found myself with no money, zero. I'm dead broke. I cannot put dinner on the table for my family. And he said, I got on my knees, I prayed to God. I said, God, I follow you, I obey you. I know you're looking after me. Please help me. And then he said, and I heard a voice saying, why do you still worry? And then he said, and my son came back from school later on with 600 Chinese yuan for a school scholarship, which is probably $50, $60 back then. It turned out it was the first time ever my school had given out a scholarship, started giving out scholarship. So he got a little emotional telling that story, and then this story stuck with me all these years, the sequence of pictures that he painted. I cannot even imagine, as I grew older, what he was going through. At the prime of his career, late 30s, the leading man of the family, absolute peak of his artistry as a musician and artist, with incredible business opportunities in front of him. He turned that all down. So this was 10 years into his full-time serving God. 10 plus years of, I can imagine, back and forth with God, the negotiation, the compromising, the bargaining, and also the struggle, with his close friend circle, with the whole family, with my mom even, and with himself internally, and also with God. I think 10 years of that, all that led to that moment, that morning, that moment of absolute clarity and conviction. His purity of faith. So he has this just sometimes this naive optimism. Like, we actually joke about this. Ezra and my dad, they're close friends for a reason. I think that they share this just blind optimism, just sometimes naive, sometimes it's just infuriating. But I think that's where it came from. It's just their shared faith, their shared purity of their faith. So as I said, I hope that by telling this story, I can help people understand better what Chinese Christians are really like. Because I do think there's a natural difference between the Christians in the United States and the Christians in China. One being born into it, born Christian with the absolute freedom to worship, to practice your faith. And the other one is born again. You found this, well into your adult life, and then on top of that, without the freedom to worship. And because of that, I think, when you're born into it, then sometimes you take things for granted. But on the other hand, because you were born again and without the freedom to practice what you believe, just because of that, the conviction is that much stronger. I think it's much more pure, I think. So now, not only do the Chinese Christians and Chinese churches not have any power or influence, they're one of the most persecuted groups across the country. They do not seek money, fame, power, influence. They have zero political influence or agenda or motives. All they want is the God-given freedom and right to be able to worship and practice their faith without having to conform to certain type of rules or certain type of ideology. All they want is to preserve the purity of their faith. So I think as China being, the other superpower on the other side of the world, standing as an atheist country, I think it's even more important, and it's extremely important for the U.S. To set itself apart from that, as a nation of faith, as President Trump said, like a one nation under God, to set an example and then to be a contrast of that. I think, by extension, more broadly and more importantly, not only for Christians, but I think, we should stand up as the other superpower that really stands firmly for human rights in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Gal. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you both sharing about your parents and their experience and the beautiful stories that you shared, but also putting it in the context of the broader plight of Chinese Christians in general. So thank you for sharing your reflections on that. Really, really appreciate that. We're going to turn over to Michael Kovig. He was going to join us virtually via Zoom, and unfortunately, our own technology failed us this morning, but he graciously pre-recorded a video, but he would have loved to have been here to be able to answer questions to everybody. I just wanted to give him that credit that he was going to be on standby for that. But we'll go ahead and turn to his video now.
Thank you to the Hudson Institute for shining a light on political prisoners in China, and my deepest sympathies and support to every political detainee in China and their families, including those here with us today. We should never forget that as much as the prisoners suffer, their loved ones are drawn into the same unjust web of pain. I'm going to tell you some of what happened to me, not because my story is the most important one in this room, but because I hope it helps bring more attention to the crime the Chinese Communist Party has committed against many hundreds of thousands of people. And I want to encourage you to join me in calling on Beijing to release the thousands of political prisoners and hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities it unjustly continues to incarcerate. So what happened to me? In December 2018, officers from Beijing's State Security Bureau abducted me in front of my pregnant girlfriend and drove me to a secret facility. For months, I was held under an extra-legal procedure called residential surveillance in a designated location, the party state's euphemism for an enforced disappearance. What that meant in practice was hundreds of hours of interrogation, solitary confinement without daylight, insufficient food, psychological torture, constant surveillance, threats of worse to come. It became obvious almost immediately that I and another Canadian citizen had been taken as political hostages for leverage to pressure Canada's government into releasing Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive it had arrested on an American extradition warrant. To the CCP, we were pawns in a coercion campaign that was part of a struggle for dominance with Washington. Nothing more. For the first several months, I had no lawyer, no contact with family, no books, nothing to read, just interrogators trying to coerce me into confessing to crimes I hadn't committed, to validate their false narrative about why I'd been detained. I felt trapped in a psychological tunnel with no visible end. Solitary confinement is a lonely corner of hell. UN experts consider anything over 15 days to constitute torture. In China's RSDL, it typically lasts 6 months. Mine ended in May 2019 when state security formally arrested me and transferred me to a detention center where I spent a further 2 years in a single cell. I left it only for interrogations, monthly consular visits, and one day-long secret political show trial. At the height of COVID, I couldn't leave the cell at all for 7 months. But this isn't only about me. The party's objective was explicit: to make me and my family suffer so that Canada would feel enough pain that its politicians would intervene in Meng's extradition case. It was coercion dressed up as law. When it wrongfully detained me, it didn't only hurt me in Canada. I'm also a Hungarian national, so by refusing to grant Hungary consular access, China violated my rights as a European Union citizen. My partner and our daughter are both Americans. By harming them, the party harmed American families too. My point is that political detention doesn't only harm the prisoner. China's government, in my case, also violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations by interrogating me about my previous work as a diplomat, setting a dangerous precedent that puts every country's diplomats at risk. And it violated the Canada-China consular agreement that repeatedly delayed visits, blocked care packages, and barring diplomats from my trial. So what made the difference? It meant the world to me that the US President, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and the foreign ministers of many allied countries called for my release. But what really tipped the scales was the close coordination between my family, advocates, and supporters inside and outside government and around the world. My best friend, Veena Najibullah, put her own life on hold to lead an unprecedented advocacy campaign. She, together with Canada's ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, and ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman, and hundreds of others, worked relentlessly, rallying global support, raising the costs for Beijing of holding me, piecing together a diplomatic solution. Without their extraordinary work, I could still be in that cell. In September 2021, after months of negotiations, I was finally freed, simultaneously with Meng's return to China. While I was detained, I drew some small comfort from knowing that however bad my situation was, it was better than what most Chinese political prisoners endure. Arbitrary detention of foreigners is still rare. For Chinese citizens, it is not. Thousands are suffering in it right now. My own freedom took a global effort, but it is possible. With enough attention, advocacy, and persistence, political prisoners can be freed. At the very least, their conditions can be improved. I'm living proof of that. And while detained, I drew on a deep reservoir of hope from knowing that my friends and loved ones were fighting for me. To the family members here today, have no doubt that what you're doing is existentially important to your imprisoned loved ones. To everyone else, don't just be shocked or dismayed by what you hear today. Let it move you to act. Speak up, advocate, raise costs for the CCP of brutalizing people, because authoritarian regimes calculate. When they learn that taking prisoners carries no cost, that coercion is cheap, and the world will accept the unacceptable, they do more of it. When citizens and governments work together to impose penalties, they think twice. I look forward to the day when the family members with us here can express the same gratitude that I have for my own release. That day cannot come soon enough, because until everyone is free, none of us are truly free. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Michael for his remarks, and hopefully some of what he said offers hope to each of you all, but I think his call to action and reminder that each of us has a role to play in securing political prisoner release and advocating on their behalf is just absolutely essential. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and I'm going to ask you all a question. But as I do that, audience members, please be thinking through the questions that you have. We'll have somebody going around to bring you a microphone, but if you can just say your name and your affiliation, that would be great. But I want to ask you all, if there was one thing that the US government could be doing on behalf of each of your family members, what would it be and why? Grace, can we start with you? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes, so I started advocating for my father since his detention in October, and it's been around 5 months. So I am still very new to this world and new to this unfortunate family that we are now a part of. And many things that I've heard, like one of the things that I've heard was that because my father is not an American citizen, it is really hard for America to do anything or anyone to do anything. And China also uses that as leverage and say this is domestic politics or this is domestic law enforcement and no one should interfere. But ultimately, I think that it is not a domestic issue. It is not a US-China issue. It is not like, should not just be a bargaining chip. Our freedom, our rights are not just bargaining chips, like Michael said. We're not leverage. And the governments should be around the world. People should be outraged that they are using people like leverages, like bargaining chips, like things and not like people. And so I hope and pray that President Trump in his negotiations, this upcoming summit in April, that he would stand for values and stand for human rights and morality and demand the release of all these individuals. For me personally, I just want my father back in the US with his family. Like Zeba said, see his grandkids, see my brothers graduating college and high school and such. So like oftentimes even the mentioning of their names is hugely important for their well-being, whether or not they will get visits by families or by consulars and such. And so that's what I hope for. I hope that President Trump can ask for the release of these people in his visit.
Yeah, that's great. Zeba?
I think it's important that the member of the Congress should stay behind us and continue to talk about this case. And President Trump definitely should put these cases on the agenda because failing to respond to invites Beijing to keep using family detention as a tool of coercion when foreign government can imprison a relative of US citizens in order to intimidate advocacy in America, it sets a dangerous precedent that authoritarian regime can reach out to United States to suppress freedom of speech through fear, retaliation, and collective punishment. Standing up for my mom, Gulshan, and others. Therefore, about defending both human rights and the principles that US citizens cannot be bullied into silence by threat of the foreign government.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point too, just like recognizing that, these are obviously individuals, but it's so clear that this is transnational repression when it's reaching into and affecting American citizen family members. I think, Zeba, you have, how many family members that are American citizens?
22.
Yeah, there's a lot. And I know the same is true for Grace and others, that there are a lot of American citizens being affected. But even if not, there are folks who have like asylum cases pending and otherwise. And that makes their cases really important to the US government because it is any government's duty to defend the rights of their own citizens when they're being violated, and to look for ways to go beyond that too, in order to be able to help those who are in need, especially when you have a government like the CCP that purposefully violates the rights of its own citizens. To call them out, we have a responsibility to call them out. So yeah, Gao, over to you, sorry.
Yes, yeah, well, like Grace and Zeba mentioned, I think, the most direct way and most, coming up, so is for, President Trump to mention these names and then, include these names in his agenda. But if that does not, or if it doesn't, I think it's very important for, people in the White House or, member of Congress and, senators have a ongoing effort to include these people in their daily work or adopt these cases. I think, just apply that constant pressure to the Chinese government. I think, just make them aware that it's not going to be going away easily as you wish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100% agree. Okay, we're going to turn it over to the audience for any questions that you all may have for the panelists. Yes, Sophie. Here, Talia's bringing the mic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this session. And thank you so much for this second generation to talk about it. Because I am the wife of a current political prisoner also. I strongly endorse Grace's point, because when we talk with people, my difficulty is also my husband is not American citizen. Although my 2 daughters and I, we are all American citizens. So from this case, we can always see they are not only impact one people, they are impact the whole family. I saw Grace, her husband, her parents, her husband's parents. I believe the whole family, American citizens, are involved in it. My 2 daughters originally fight together with me, but now they feel too hard to face the situation anymore. They want their own life. They don't want to be different from the other Americans. So I wish we could, whenever I thought about it, I also think, oh my God, there's so many Americans still not released yet. How I can raise my case? So I always wait and wait. But yeah, in today's meeting, I truly, strongly hope we can treat our American family same as American. This is one point. Also, another point, what Michael said. Actually, if those political prisoners is not free, none of us is free. China's threat is not only to Chinese people. That is why I set up an NGO. I want to tell everyone, China's threat is to everyone. If there is political prisoner in China, it will have prisoners, political prisoners everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Sorry, it's not a question.
That's okay. It was a very good interjection.
Endorsement of my point. Thank you.
We'll go to the other Sophie. Did you guys have that planned?
But if there's enough
other than the people named
Yeah.
we'll call you Sophie from now on too. Hi, I'm Sophie Richardson. I'm with the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, and thank you all for your presentations. Just 2 quick points. One, CHRD has a database of political prisoners, and there are thousands of cases listed there, not all of people who are still detained, but we often wonder, what's happening to family members. Sometimes we know, like in Jiaxi, sometimes we know, sometimes we don't, but I think we carry with us, the idea that it's not just the individual who's actually detained. And I think we also know how hard it is to have to keep telling your story over and over and over again. When I'm interacting with politicians on cases like these, if they don't give in quickly, I usually just ask them to imagine what it would feel like to not be able to speak to your son, your daughter, your mother, your brother, your aunt. And they at least have the brains to switch gears when they stop and think about what that must feel like. So I think your work is an extraordinary credit to your family members. But a very practical question, and Zeba, maybe I'll direct this to you, but of course, obviously, everybody who's experiencing this should weigh in. The argument back, your family member isn't a US citizen, and therefore there's nothing we can do, is really, I think, infuriating and so profoundly demoralizing, and it really, I think, cuts against a basic premise of the human rights movement, which is that it's about humans, regardless of their citizenship. But as a practical matter, Zeba, if you were going to overhaul or create a position within the U.S. government, fine-tune SPIHA, for example, what would that look like? Is that somebody who's at the State Department who is actively reaching out across diaspora communities to find out? Because not everybody wants to be public about these kinds of cases. Do we make the case that if cases rise to the level of clearly being, wrongful or arbitrary detentions, that there should be a move to somehow grant someone U.S. citizenship by default so that the U.S. can weigh in on those cases? What would you want that to look like? It's a big, messy question, but it seems a good moment for our family here to brainstorm a little bit about some new ideas. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks.
you so much. What I dare not to say. Because, sorry, there's one point.
You can get
There's one point is
My husband, and also same as Dr. Jim, they were on the travel ban, on the border control. My husband, even both of them with Pastor Jim, if they're out of the small jail, both of them are not able to come to United States because they are in the border control name list. My husband go to the border, they are not allow him to go abroad for the national security reasons, same as Pastor Jim. So this is really a big problem of them get out of small jail, and then the big jail is jailing them. Thank you.
Thank you. And Zeba, did you want to take that question?
Yes, I think personally there should be a mechanism that talks with the administration and the State Department on these cases. Yes, our family members are not U.S. citizens, but we are U.S. citizens. We live here. We're Americans, and this is inflicting pain on us. And so, and for that reason, also when it comes to meetings and summits and talk like this, which is upcoming, there should be something that we can work together to make these cases a priority to the administration, and we need help. We can't do that on our own. And also, we have a law, Bob Levinson Hostage Act, which particularly directed to American citizens, but Congress should somehow pass an amendment to include the immediate family members of American citizens to that law, so we have more tools that we can use. I think if we don't put in stop to this, this is going to keep happening. Look at Grace's father and Gao's parents, and it just keeps happening. And there's Hong Kong community that there's bounty on their heads, and they're U.S. citizens. And
Yeah, we have Francis here in the audience.
Yes. Yeah.
No matter Christian or non-Christian, political or conscientious.
I have a quick thing that I want, maybe quick, hopefully quick.
It doesn't have to be quick.
One is that, Sophie, what you were mentioning about the SPIHA, I think with the last year's NDAA, they passed legislation that will include foreign nationals to be who might be able to qualify for some SPIHA services as well. So if we can continue on expanding the SPIHA Special Envoy to Hostage Affairs in the State Department. But I also want to say that the U.S. is actually incredibly in the forefront of this type of diplomacy and network, and just the fact that we have a SPIHA in our State Department versus any other country in the world. It's infuriating when I go to Europe and then no one, there's even less that they want to talk about, and there's even less that they can do. And they also are, many of them stands for human rights and religious freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of minorities and all of these things, and yet they do even less, and there's less coordination between the government. So if we, instead of having families go to all these countries trying to just talk to 20 departments and 600 MPs in the EU, It would just be so incredible if we have more coordination either in the State Department level or in these, like encouraging these European parliaments or any other countries to also have set up something like this so that they can also talk to one another and make a global network of countries who would speak out and act on the release of individuals. Because like many people say here, that it matters when one person who is not even their US, like not even a citizen, when it hurts everyone. It hurts Americans, it hurts Canadians, it hurts Australians, it hurts everyone across the world. So
it's a global
yes.
challenge. Yeah, I also wanted to weigh in here. My own work here at Hudson, I published a report where I advocated for the creation of an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy. And this is not to replace the work of the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, because they do incredible work. But for SPIHA, their primary remit is hostages, and generally American hostages. And a lot of political prisoners don't identify as a hostage. They identify as a political prisoner because they took a specific stand. It's very different from a hostage. For many of them, they feel it's very different, even in terms of identity. And I'll talk about this a bit more on the second panel, but I think there's a real place for having an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy with a special envoy of ambassador rank that's Senate confirmed, that has that type of authority within State Department, and that the role of that individual would be to, yes, liaise with the family members to make communication a lot better, but also to take the concerns of those family members and to make sure that they're raised in diplomacy, that they're a high-profile priority, and not something that gets lost when people are saying, well, it's really the economic side of things that matters, or it's really the national security side of things that matters. No, it is a priority for us to raise political prisoner and to call for their release, because advocating for freedom is a priority of the U.S. government. I think the creation of that would be very helpful and would augment SPIHA and actually make it so that they don't have to be overextended, because it is not an easy job to be the special envoy for hostage affairs. I don't think it would be an easy job to be a special envoy for the Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy either, but it's needed, and it's a gap that we have in the U.S. government. So, yeah. Yes, Kelly. Wait for the mic, sorry.
I'm Kelly Curry. I think this is an important point, and I wish Michael was here, because he can speak to this also about this distinction between hostages and political prisoners. And even though political prisoners are treated like hostages, by the Chinese party state, if we decide to lump them together, then that creates some real moral hazards on our part. At the same time, when Michael was detained, when the two Michaels were detained, because there was another Michael who was also detained at the same time, and they were clearly it was clearly hostage taking, even though Michael Kovig and the other Michael were doing things that politically were disfavored by the regime. They were clearly taken as hostages. And I went to the Canadian government at that time in New York. I went to my counterpart at the UN and said, these people are hostages. You need to respond in kind. You need to take hostages. I told them that they have plenty of people. No, I'm serious. I told them you have plenty of people in in Canada of Chinese extraction who are here, and they have undocumented sources of wealth. They've bought multi-million-dollar homes in Vancouver and British Columbia, and have no obvious source of means in order to buy multi-million-dollar homes. You need to open tax investigations into all these people. If they are, and you've got to create leverage. Now, I think in general that's a principle that makes sense when it comes to hostages, but I do think it is important to make a distinction when we are talking about political prisoners. I love Sophie's idea about creating a mechanism to apply for citizenship and abstention for family members. I think that's a really important thing that Congress could move forward on, because
I've
Congress
actually
can.
done a little
They can
research on
do
this,
it.
and they can
Oh,
totally,
they can
with the
easily
wave of the
create,
wand,
but
anyone
that's what I
can
was
be an
gonna say. They
American.
can easily
Yes.
create a new immigration category. It's like,
They actually have the ability
Yeah.
already and have done it in, I think,
Just very
Iranian
rare
cases and some
cases,
other
yes.
cases where they've passed legislation that said, like, you can be a citizen and
Yes.
then when you come
those
here.
are personal bills.
Yes.
And those, but I'm saying create an immigration category that creates a discretionary possibility on the side of the executive branch to be able to do it on a discretionary basis without it having to go through a personal bill every single time.
Yeah, and also I will say this, Pedro Paisano, who's in the audience with us here from McCain Institute, and he's going to join us on stage later. He hosted a fabulous conference last week on hostages and political prisoners and otherwise, and this was a topic of conversation during a lot of those panels, was thinking through how do you make sure that the immigration system actually has the capacity and the capability to ensure the resettlement of somebody, particularly a political prisoner, where you have a very, very short runway for, if there's an opening to get somebody out, you got to get them here. And so I know I had some sideline conversations where somebody said it's very, very rarely used, but they have something called, like, I think it's port humanitarian parole, where you can process somebody within like 24 to 48 hours, but it is so rarely used, and it's at the president's discretion. Most of the other parole categories that we have take 2 weeks on an expedite, like that's the good outcome. And that's completely unacceptable for somebody who's been released on a whim, needs to get out, needs to come here, especially if they have American citizen family members to receive them. And I think not only working within the US system, but also, as you said, Grace, making sure that other countries too, because like for Jimmy Lai, for example, he's a British national overseas passport, so he would go most likely to the UK or he would go somewhere else. So thinking about those options that are available for others in other country contexts is very important. Other questions from the audience? Yes. Sorry, wait 1 second for the mic so people online can hear.
Thank you. Lagman Fatahi from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Just to touch on your point around providing humanitarian parole visas. Yeah, there's been, especially with respect to supporting journalists as risk, there's a global conversation around how to provide humanitarian parole visas more expeditiously when journalists, in the case of CPJ, which is our mandates around press freedom and journalist safety, to make sure that journalists get paroles more expeditiously, because the normal visa process would not necessarily be responsive to emergency situations. So we had seen this in cases like Ukraine, Afghanistan, and elsewhere where you have had also major conflict, but it doesn't necessarily have to be conflict as well. So I think that's an important conversation to have around how we can make the visa system or this parole system more responsive to urgent cases.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And I would also just add here, one of the challenges too with humanitarian parole, it's an incredibly useful mechanism to be able to have, but it doesn't confer an official immigration status. So then anybody who comes here is being forced to essentially enter the asylum system, which is a very long and arduous process. I know, I think we've spoken before, Alfadar, about like 10 years of Uyghurs waiting for their status to be adjusted. That's completely unacceptable when somebody has already been like really, truly targeted, exploited, victimized through the political prison system, and then is coming here with the uncertainty of whether or not they're going to be able to stay and be safe here. That's unacceptable. So I think looking for ways to work on that aspect of the system is absolutely essential. Yeah, Grace, did you want to weigh in too?
Just kind of going back to the step one of getting our parents released first. Oftentimes, like Olivia, what you said, and just based on the conversation that we had, is that I feel like we as citizens, we constantly have to fight government departments to make political prisoners or like humanitarian type of arguments in these debates about trade and like national security and all these. And in some ways, the USG or foreign governments become, or the governments that claim that they care about our families and values become the hardest people to move. And so to have an ambassador or a department or someone who is there for us, there to talk to within the government like within government level, to say, no, this is important, just as important as the video chip trade. I don't know. I think that is extremely important. It's a change of mindset of how to do this type of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. And I think, like, to the extent that we can think creatively about how to integrate it's so obvious on its face that your family members should be a priority, but making it so that folks in Congress, folks in the administration, folks around the globe cannot look away, that it would just be absolutely illogical to go and have meetings. There should not be a single meeting between U.S. and Chinese counterparts where your family members are not raised by name and called for their release. But it's not the muscle memory yet here in Washington. And I think that's a challenge to all of us here to think through. How do we make it so that there's no choice, that it would be shocking if your family members are not raised, clearly. Any other questions from audience members? Back to the Sophies. You can give her the mic.
Sorry, Kelly noticed me twitch at your reference to muscle memory. I wish it was the case that it was a lack of muscle memory. I think we're roughly 30 years into the project of democratic governments, here in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, fill in the blanks, knowing full well about cases like these and not being willing to prioritize, human beings over, particularly trade interests and security matters. I don't think there's a lack of comprehension about, the human cost. I don't think there's a lack of understanding of how unbelievably brutal and repressive Xi Jinping's government is. These are choices that governments make consistently. For a long time, I was screaming at a diplomat at 5 o'clock in the morning last Friday, on a case that's gone on for years and years and years. And I think the challenge for a lot of us, and especially for the family members, is finding the right moment, the right constellation of people who care more about what's happening to your family members and seeing them as emblematic of a larger relationship and being willing to fight for that, often against their own parties, their own administration. I wish I could say that in years of doing this work, that in any particular location, that there was a consistent set of actors who performed well on these. But I do think that having a designated person in governments, would be one step at least towards taking the burden off you guys, right? I would happily support that, but I think the world is on fire, and it's that much harder to make the case that having a reasonable relationship with the people in power in Beijing has to be tested against how individual human beings who have broken laws
and
end up
like
being
I mentioned,
tested.
So many people, when it comes to China, are pretending to be asleep. And so are pretending to be asleep. And so it's so hard to actually make them, like you're like, oh, as long as I tell my story, they will do stuff, right? And it's really difficult. But I feel like to make it so that the Chinese government also generally, like it doesn't cost them anything right now to take anyone as hostage or as political prisoners. And in some ways, like, if they want to be treated like a normal country that does things like a normal, respectable country, I think they need to prove themselves to be a normal, respectable country before we always just treat them like one. And so I think that's important to kind of like make it so that it's in their incentive as well to act like a powerful, normal country that they want to present themselves to be.
Yeah. Any other questions before we take a break? Oh, yeah, Alfidar.
Hello, everyone. Alfidar Iltiber. Not really a question. I'm just thinking out loud. Even though normally I'm an optimistic person, I'm just digesting what Sophie suggested, like giving us U.S. citizenship to our parents there so they can be rescued. But the Chinese government is always 2 steps ahead. I feel like once we do that, they're not going to give a passport or something like that to our parents, right? Which family members are facing right now. Even though they're not in jail, they can't come out to meet the family members because they don't get their passports. Maybe so this special parole visa without a passport might work. As you know, recently 3 Uyghurs were brought to US. We were very happy, still happy, thanking the US government. But they were like normal citizens. They were not in jails or detentions or camps. But we gave away, as a US, the criminals back. So it wasn't really fair trade, like exchange. So I think our US government should, stay strong and firm and demanding more. It's just my thought, like if there's other ways to get our family members back, even we just want to see them, meet them, maybe in the 3rd country if they can come to US, like some path so we can see our family members. I think we should fight hard for that.
I think one of the biggest challenges with political prisoner advocacy and also separately hostage advocacy is figuring out what leverage we do have and what leverage we don't have. And if we don't have leverage at a given moment, to consider ways to actually create leverage. And sometimes that has to be done out of thin air. But you have to look for those creative ways. And I think, as I mentioned at the outset, I think we're in a unique moment where actually we already have leverage there. The CCP really did make a misstep when they threatened to limit rare earth exports, and they've given nothing in return for it. So I think the ball is fully within the administration's court to take advantage of the fact that the CCP did step out of line, and that we have an opportunity now to say, look, we need a sign of good faith if we're going to continue to move forward with trade negotiations or with other priorities. And I think this is something where we didn't even have to create leverage. The CCP handed it to us. So I think trying to think through creative ways where, the CCP kind of owes us one, if you will, can be quite helpful as we think about negotiations and whatnot. But I think it is really challenging to think through who you can give in exchange, because sometimes they do want man for man, body for body. And I mean, I've heard in the past that, sometimes you can give back old spies that you've already kind of milked for all the information that you already need. Those people can go back, and they're treasonous coming and spying, but the US doesn't have much to lose by giving those individuals back. So maybe that's something to think of as opposed to criminal for criminal, if that makes sense. Yeah, Tori.
Hi there, Tori Smith, Forbes Tate Partners. And I loved your mention of, leverage. What more leverage do we need? But I would love if y'all could speak to the existing tools the U.S. government has to impose more leverage, to create more leverage. And this may be my lack of knowledge, but has the U.S. government imposed sanctions on the individuals who carried out these actions against Christian pastors? Have they imposed sanctions on the individuals that detained Zeba's mom? In my mind, every time a U.S. nexus, a U.S. citizen is harmed by transnational repression, there should be a punishment in that moment.
Yeah.
Not just the mentioning of these individuals in these negotiations, but there should be a cost of inflicting this pain and violating the rights of American citizens. And then that creates leverage, right? Because it's you release this person, you bring them back to their family, and we will lift these sanctions, right? And to these individuals in China, these sanctions have a cost. So I'd love to hear existing tools that haven't been used yet in the sanction space, and what other tools that maybe Congress should be creating, so that there is a physical, painful cost every time something like this is inflicted.
Yeah, that's good. Did you guys want to weigh in, or should I take the first jump? Okay. To my knowledge, there have not been individuals that were sanctioned for these folks' parents specifically. And I don't even know that, I know in the first Trump administration, they did a lot of different thematic tranches of sanctions. I believe there were ones over Uyghur forced labor issues. I think there might have been some over the camps that were done. But this habit of using global Magnitsky sanctions, which you can target an individual or an entity on human rights and corruption grounds, those tranches have not continued. I don't believe they continued under the Biden administration. They have not been re-picked up under the Trump administration. So I do think this is an area where you for sure could use those more individualized, targeted sanctions. But this is another reason too why in my own report, when I advocated for the creation of an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy, I also was arguing for the creation of an annual report on political prisoners that would highlight some of the high priority political prisoners, that would talk about what the US government was or was not doing to advocate on behalf of those specific cases. Some of that could be even in a private classified annex that was just for like Congress to be able to look at as a reporting mechanism. But beyond that, to have a list of individuals and entities who are ripe for sanctioning, and to require the US government to actually say, well, if we already have identified these targets for sanctioning, why have they not yet been targeted? And to have that be an annual report with those targets, again, could be classified annex so you don't have asset flight or the like. But I thought that that was a way on an annualized basis to keep US attention on the issue, and to have an annualized mechanism for upping the ante and presenting leverage and opportunity.
So from a personal perspective, we are also tasked with figuring out who they are in the first place, and often we don't even know. Like in my father's case, we know that there's a specialized Zion task force that was created, but I have no idea who they are. No one knows who they are, even in China. Secondly, all we know is like a jailer's name, and at the same time we're like, do we want to make this jailer our enemy, and then he will just end up like taking it out on our loved ones? And so there's like so much that you can like, and maybe this jailer will never even want to come to the US or some other, like, so like for us, it's like the amount of potential things that could actually negatively impact. And this jailer is obviously not the person who makes that decision in the first place. So like who the upper echelons of power who is making the decision is, we don't know. Maybe the intel community has information that I am not privy to, and it would be great if there was a better like communication system of that type of sort of thing that is in the classified or whatever source. But secondly, I also think that like civil society does have a lot of things that they can also do. For example, I know that in like the Falun Gong cases, there's a lot of like doctors that are being like called out, and there's a lot of movement potentially to say like maybe you can't have any scholarships or do exchanges with like medical, or like you can't like present your report in medical like places, etc. But potentially same with the lawyers, same with the prosecutors, same with the judges. Like maybe again, I mean, if you look at like Nuremberg, these people were held accountable to what they did at the courts. And so, again, just to remind them that history is watching you, and we are like your case history will not disappear. And so, like, potentially also saying, like, don't invite these prosecutors, don't invite these lawyers, don't invite these judges to your legal galas or events or whatever too. That could also be an incredibly powerful statement or movement to potentially work on.
I saw Sophie's eyebrows raise when you were saying international accountability, because your favorite is universal jurisdiction, like pursuing potential for prosecution and whatnot. But also, I was reminded when you were talking about different sanctions too, that I know like CFHK did a lot of work when I was there to help put together the like Hong Kong Judicial Sanctions Act, and the idea behind that is that you go after the judges and the prosecutors who are the ones who like agreed to be part of the trials, agreed to be part of the persecution of Jimmy, Gwyneth Ho, like all the Lee Chuk-yan, like going beyond like those individuals who are responsible for putting people behind bars and keeping them behind bars. And it's a really good idea. I know a lot of times our government is nervous about holding those judges and prosecutors accountable for quote unquote doing their job, but these folks are going way beyond what their job requires by putting innocent people behind bars.
Yeah.
And
or
so,
make it so that they can't even hold a court because the judges are all afraid to be named, to be the judge, to you know. So making it difficult for them as well to like just make it costly for each step as well, potentially. And even potentially these police or jailers or the general PSB officials, they're going around making like Zion church members sign a blank piece of paper and then fabricating like charges against the people in prison. Like find out who those people are, and I don't know, like make it also just like either naming or shaming, putting it in some sort of a documentation. We don't have to sanction them right away, but there are a lot that potentially the civil society can do before the USG comes, and it's a cumbersome process too. Yeah.
Just want to answer Tori's question on the particular case for my mom. If I remember correctly, last year there's a clause in the appropriation bill to sanction those who was responsible for her arrest. But again, to Grace's point, we don't have the name, we don't know who it is, so that's the challenge there that for us to. Because this happened in 2018 in Xinjiang politics, people are constantly changing, and it's just a hassle to get those names.
Sounds like we need to engage like C4ADS or some of the more investigative groups to be able to hunt those people down, because it's actually not that difficult to get the information for those individuals, because these types of folks already have the expertise to be able to look for them. So maybe that's something we can do. I feel like, Frances, did I see your hand up before? She already said it. Okay, great. So if you all would join me in thanking our panelists for today. We're going to take about 5-7 minutes to do a changeover for our second panel. If anybody wants to just refill on coffee, I know I had you guys here a little bit early, so we'll do that and then make the transition to panel number 2.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for your presence here this morning to our first panel. Incredibly powerful, moving, intellectually at a soul level, at a human level. This is a privilege to be part of this event today. Olivia, thanks for your leadership for convening this important event at a timely moment with the US-China summit coming up. There's no better time and no better conversation for us to be having now than this one. A few brief observations as we transition into the second panel. I think the reason the first panel, quite obviously, was so impactful was because it puts a human face to what can be an often abstract discussion about human rights and transnational repression. And I think this is important for those of us who work in the policy space and for those of us who try to reach policymakers every single day to get over this challenge, obviously, of making the abstract personal and making the theoretical actual. And three things stuck me as I was listening to this first panel and as we transition into this next one about broadly with US-China, political prisoners, human rights, what we can do to elevate this issue. Number one, and this was brought up, I think, by Grace in the prior panel, talking about political prisoners is not a distraction from grand strategy. It is not a distraction from national security. It is the essence of it as the United States. There was this through line of faith in panel number one, and I'll take that as an open door just to share a brief observation from my faith as a Christian. When we talk about great power competition, which is what I spend most of my time doing here at Hudson, we often think of the great powers of history and great powers of the world today wrangling and jockeying with each other for trade and for military might and for everything else that's material. But as a Christian, when you look at great power competition, in my book of faith, the Bible, Genesis 14 is one of these arresting moments where you see 9 different armies, 5 on 4, fighting each other. But the story is not about the armies at all. It's about the family at the fault lines of that warfare. And it was when, in the pages of Scripture, Abraham is separated from his nephew Lot. And it is in the midst of warfare and literally great power competition that you see a family member rushing to save and bring back his own family back with him. And as people of faith, whether we are Christians, whether we're Muslims, whether we're atheists, or have different faith persuasions, I think that humanity is something that is so crucial for us to remember, that this is not a distraction from what we do as strategists or as advocates or policymakers. It is wrapped up in the very fabric of it. Number two, I think this was another through line from panel number one, which I imagine we will spend a lot of time talking about on this panel, ways to raise the costs for our adversaries because their vulnerability is acute. It is quite impressive that the Chinese Communist Party has the capabilities that they do to surveil, to censor, to capture, to detain, to intimidate and torture, but it's quite unimpressive that they feel the need to do this at all in the first place. And it is one of their biggest vulnerabilities that can be leveraged strategically. Number three, this was also mentioned in the first panel. If we do not elevate these questions of human rights and political prisoners and hostages, all of the material concerns that policymakers often care about more, unfortunately, whether it be the AI chips that Grace brought up in the first panel, whether it's the commercial concerns that a number of other folks have discussed, all of those things will get worse if we do not address the human element of political prisoners. Because policymakers, as we all know, have for so long sacrificed quote unquote competitive or confrontational equities because there's always a cooperative thing that they want to secure in the next high-level meeting. And the longer American policymakers wait to find a way to force the CCP's hand, all of these other things that people care about, whether it be trade, whether it be investment, whether it be AI competition, the military balance, these will continue to metastasize and get worse if we look at the CCP as an entity that we can negotiate with diplomatically for a win-win outcome. So with all of those things, the first panel was incredibly powerful, and I think we have a lot to get into right now for those observations and so many others. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to give them the opportunity to share for about 5 minutes each or so, 5 to 7 minutes or so, about their work as advocates for political prisoners. And then we'll similarly have a moderated discussion. And I think to Michael Kovig's point where he said what really made the difference for him was advocates who were going to the policymakers around the whole world and linking his family to elected officials, to civil society. And these are the people who do that. So that's why I'm glad to be here and very excited for this panel. So briefly introduce. To my immediate left is Pedro Pisano, who is the founding director of the John McCain Freedom for Political Prisoners Initiative. We will call it FPPI for the rest of this conversation. He's also the director of global democracy programs at the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. Pedro is a lawyer specializing in democracy and human rights, and he works with families, governments, and civil society to advance, coordinate international efforts for the freedom and recovery of political prisoners, hostages, and wrongful detainees. And you've been involved in work in a number of countries, Belarus, Venezuela, Georgia. You've done work in Gaza also, and more immediately, China, in addition to Russia and Iran. So you were quite busy and looking forward to hearing...
the easy places.
Yeah, the easy places, that's right. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Pedro. Thank you. Briefly, I'll introduce Corey as well. Corey Jackson is the founder and president of Luke Alliance, a nonprofit providing restorative care and global advocacy for persecuted Christians. Prior to the Luke Alliance, Corey founded and served for 15 years as a senior pastor at Trinity Park Church, PCA, in Cary, North Carolina, which is a good state. It's where my wife's from. It's a good place there. Multicultural church home that is home for Christians over 25 different cultural backgrounds. You lived in China as well, which I'm interested in hearing some of your experience there too, from 1998 to 2005. You speak Mandarin. Corey has served as an advisor for a large urban house church movement in China for the past 15 years. You're originally from Alabama. Corey has a bachelor's from Auburn and a Master of Divinity from Reformed Theological Seminary. You've been quoted in multiple outlets, New York Times, BBC, Christianity Today, among others. Finally, at the very end, Olivia Enos, senior fellow here at Hudson, longtime leader in the human rights advocacy space for well over a decade now. Olivia writes on a wide range of human rights, national security issues in Asia. She's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, contributor at Forbes. She previously worked as Washington director for Committee of Freedom and Hong Kong Foundation. Before that, she was a senior policy analyst for Asian Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. And she has written on international human rights issues, human trafficking, transnational crime, and a number of other different issues in contexts ranging from China, North Korea, Burma, and other parts of Asia. Master's in Asian Studies from Georgetown and bachelor's from Patrick Henry College. So with that table setting, let's dive in. We'll start with Pedro for your opening remarks about ways that we can elevate, including the upcoming Trump-Xi meeting, but even beyond, where you see this policy space going. And then we'll go down the line, and then we'll have a discussion after. But Pedro, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a privilege and an honor to be here with you and Olivia and Corey. You have already done so much work raising these cases and pushing them into policy conversation. As Michael said, I'm Pedro Pisano, and this is the last time I'll say it, the director of the John McCain Freedom for Political Prisoners at the McCain Institute of Arizona State University. You told me I had 5 minutes, but I'll try to keep it shorter, leave time for questions, suggestions, comments, or insults, as John McCain liked to quit.
That's right.
So I have 4 quick points, if I can get this to work.
Technology.
I just got this. Anyways, let me switch to my computer. So 4 points.
That's right.
The first one, I'll signpost the 4 points and then go quickly into them. The first one is power and faith of the individual. The second one is America's first freedom The third one is freedom starts with a name, and we'll end on leverage. So I first want to recognize how profoundly moved and recognize the bravery and strength of Grace, Zeba, and Gao and their parents. They and their parents are the partners and the prophets of tomorrow's free and democratic China. That's a quote from Nathan Sharansky. They also remind us, as Gao said, not to take our own freedoms for granted. Now, the CCP is so afraid of the individual and of us worshiping freely that just 6 days after, as Zeba said, 6 days after her daughter's grandma, her other grandma, spoke on this stage, 6 days after, they put her into prison. And so that they are here today speaking, that is bravery. And I'm just so proud and honored to stand with them here and always. America's first freedom. So the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, I'll repeat it again, it bears repeating. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. When Congressman Peter Roskam introduced Grace at the Net Awards, he said, America's first freedom was born of a scandalous conviction that allegiance to God transcends any earthly power. And that's exactly what Pastor Jin, Pastor Gao, Gulshan Abbas, the Tibetans, and others have done. They have told the Chinese Communist Party, you are not my emperor. My savior is my emperor, and it is him alone I serve. Our responsibility today is to make sure we give voice to people like them. My third point. Freedom starts with a name. So CHRD, who Sophie co-directs, and Michael Kovig posted this morning that there's 1,471 people as political prisoners and 243 in pretrial detention. The Congressional Executive Commission has 2,755 active detentions and 7,000, and Dewey House Political Prisoner Database lists 7,157 cases. And none of those counts the millions of Uyghurs that are detained. But I want to say freedom starts with a name, and that's what we've done today. So let me say the names again and emphasize what Olivia said at the beginning. We need to create the political incentives for both Xi and Trump here and in China. We're not releasing Pastor Jin, Pastor Gao, and his wife, and Gulshan Abbas becomes a political domestic problem for them. Before the first Xi Jinping and Trump meeting, and then at every single meeting. Freedom starts with a name. Last one, leverage. So Washington already has the tools to act. One way the U.S. could pursue justice is the case by imposing Magnitsky sanctions of the jailers involved. And we started this discussion, but I'll name the names. First, let me say, there's only been 2 cases of Magnitsky sanctions for a single case of arbitrary detention. That's been Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexei Goranov, both in Russia. It's difficult because the Magnitsky says gross human rights abuses, but they have been used for a single case. And so I'm publicly calling here, and there's submissions that we can do together. There's a human rights first template. We can actually do this, and Grace will talk through all the concerns and how that improves the prison conditions. But we should sanction Secretary Li Ganjie, Justice He Rong, Chinese Minister of Public Security Wang Xianzhong, and Chinese President Xi Jinping for the cases of single arbitrary detention. This would hold them accountable for their human rights abuses and arbitrary detention of all your family members. We also have state-sponsored wrongful detention. It will never be applied to China, but there is another tool. Grace mentioned the NDA. There's a Countering Wrongful Detention Act that includes third-party nationals. And as Michael said, and I'll conclude with this, if we don't do this, all the other things, all the trade, all the critical minimums, it will get worse, right? Freedom starts with a name. We have the leverage. And we stand with Grace, Gao, and Zeba, Claire and Sebastian Lai, and all of them. And I'll close with this last quote from McCain that he used to quote Chairman Mao. And he would say, It's always darkest before it goes pitch black. He meant it as a joke, quoting Chairman Mao, which he never said it. McCain would never quote Chairman Mao, but we stand with McCain and his faith that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that your family members will be free, and that all political prisoners. The tunnel is dark, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Mao never saw it, but we do. So let's fight for freedom. I'm honored to stand with you, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Pedro, thank you so much. There's a lot to dig into there, which I imagine is particularly on point number 4. When we get to Q&A, we'll unpack ways to key into leverage, but your point about the importance of naming people and moving the abstract to the actual, that is, it's not only powerful because these are humans, but because of the family that are doing the hard work of advocating for them and making sure they're not forgotten and become abstract. So thank you so much, Pedro. Really appreciate those opening remarks. Corey, let's move over to you now.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I work very closely with Grace and Gal on their cases on a day-to-day basis, and to see all of your courage, including Zeba, to stand up here and to tell your family story again and again, and to go on the record, it's incredibly compelling, and it's an honor to be here with you. So in my remarks, I'm going to focus specifically on how the U.S. government can help Christians across China, and specifically pastors and Christian workers who are in prison, since that's Luke Alliance's area of concentration. My ideas fall into 3 main areas. So the first is, how can we alleviate the suffering of detained Christian pastors inside China, specifically those in prison? Second, a little bit different, how can we alleviate the suffering of Chinese pastors in the U.S. context? And then third, how do we advocate for Chinese pastors in the multilateral context? So first of all, how do we work with the U.S. government to alleviate the suffering of Chinese pastors in prison in China? I want to start by saying that in Trump 1, I worked very closely with the administration, State Department, Sam Brownback, and we were able to secure the release of Wang Yi's wife, Zhang Rong, which was incredible. It's kind of how I got started in this. It was unintentional, but seeing the work of those in the West Wing of the White House, and I just want to state that I'm grateful that we live in a country where we can have these conversations, that there's already momentum that's happening. I know it's difficult, but I believe with the intelligence workers, the various teams at state, NSC, White House Faith Office, senators and congressmen, many of whom I've met over the years, that there is precedent for support, and there is some level of current momentum, though we have this conference to push for more. We must do more. We need to secure the release of these pastors by focusing on a few cases where there are acute medical needs, and I want to point some of those out to you. Ezra Jin, Grace Jin Drexel's father, who's probably the most famous pastor in China. I would call him like the Billy Graham of China, just so you know, to put him on a scale for everyone to understand. He was leading a Bible study before he was arrested that had 10,000 people joining regularly. He's a household name in China. He's sick, and we're not sure if he's been given regular medication as prescribed by his doctor. Pang Yu, Galpu's mother, struggles with heart-related issues, and even prior to her arrest, suffered from deep bouts of anxiety. There are many more we could mention, but along with Jimmy Lai, while not a pastor or a Christian leader, is a devout Catholic who also has acute medical needs. These cases should be brought up in the next meeting between President Trump and Chairman Xi. What's happening to these pastors and the many other Christian workers who have been detained over the past year? We just had a conversation about this. I know there are nuances, but it essentially amounts to hostage-taking by the Chinese government. It's obvious that China doesn't care about human rights, or else they would not treat their own citizens this way. China is obviously using this as leverage because the U.S., we do prioritize human rights, and President Trump's support base especially cares deeply about the plight of persecuted Christians around the world, particularly in nations like China. So China sees this imprisonment of pastors as a leverage point for negotiations. How will we respond? I believe this is the ideal time for President Trump, who has done impressive work on behalf of hostages in Israel, Afghanistan, and even in China, to include negotiations to free Ezra Jin, Pang Yu, Gao Chuanfu, Jimmy Lai, Gulshan Abbas, and others. The best place to secure prisoner releases is in these face-to-face meetings between POTUS and Xi, and we're grateful, as Olivia mentioned, that there seems to be multiple bites at the apple this year. And so we do believe that for most of these prisoner releases to happen, it's going to need to happen at the executive level. So if President Trump does not mention these cases at the executive level in these meetings, I believe we do not stand a great chance of achieving them. It's very important that he mentions these cases. Prisoner releases are not the only way we can help prisoners in China. Through the State Department and the embassy system, the USG can impress upon counterparts various asks, such as for the prisoners to receive Bibles or their religious books. 7 of the Zion prisoners, all men, interestingly, have received Bibles, which is actually quite unusual. I've been asking for that for Wang Yi for 7 years, and it hasn't happened. We can see medical checks conducted, family visits. I have seen repeatedly over time, as the State Department engages with Chinese counterparts, that we can achieve these kind of visits. We can achieve these type of results, although you have to really work at it. The second area I want to address is how can we alleviate the suffering of Chinese pastors in the U.S. context? And I'm going to use the example of Grace Jen Drexel's family to talk very practically why it's so important that we work to alleviate the suffering of Christians, not just inside China, but also inside the United States. I believe that it's distinctly possible that President Trump, should he set his mind to it, could achieve the release of Ezra Jin at one of these summits. He can be quite persuasive if he sets his mind on it. So what if that were to happen? Well, the best scenario for Ezra would be for him to enter the U.S., not just on humanitarian parole, but as a refugee. If he were to enter as a refugee, he would be afforded longer-term rights and privileges, which would make it more likely for him to live in the U.S. without encountering legal issues in the long term. As it stands now, all refugee pathways are closed for Ezra and many others like him. Though by every merit of what the USCIS considers to be a meritorious refugee case, he would fit the bill. Then we consider Grace's mother, Ezra's wife, Anna Liu. Anna lives in the U.S. and has been a grad student at a seminary for a few years. Based on what's happened in Zion in October with her husband being put in prison along with 17 others, she now is claiming asylum in the U.S. But as it stands, there is no open pathway for the wife of Ezra Jin to be approved as an asylum case in the United States. Until the White House moves on this matter, opening up refugee and asylum pathways again, these obvious and meritorious cases cannot be approved. USCIS and DHS hands are effectively tied. Grace's own family embodies in microcosm the immigration challenge that is before us. Pathways need to, in a measured way, be reopened for persecuted Christians from China and from the 17 other countries who are already designated as countries of particular concern to be achieved. Now, we've already seen how valuable welcoming dissidents from our strategic competitors can be. We did it a lot during the Cold War. China is and will likely remain our biggest strategic competitor for some time. We should absolutely have a pathway to welcome Chinese dissidents, if not for the moral imperative, which is obvious, then at least for the strategic value. We can talk about that more later. I have proposed to the White House Faith Office already, it's sitting on their desk, that the president open the refugee pathway by prioritizing people who are persecuted for their faith in countries of particular concern. This should include people from any faith who are suffering from repression, to be clear. But since the president has a personal interest in Christians, and that's the area that I work in, I'm asking him to save persecuted Christians, particularly from China, who need safe passage to the U.S. To be clear, I believe that the general focus on a return to rule of law in this administration regarding immigration is a good and necessary thing. I am not suggesting open borders or anything of the sort. I am asking for a very specific action from the president to empower secretaries of state or secretaries of DHS to make recommendations for persecuted Christians from CPCs to be admitted under the current active U.S. RAP, which as it stands still has over 7,000 slots that have not been filled or occupied due to the constraints of the current executive order. To your point about our country and religious freedom, this upcoming Independence Day marks the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country. This administration has put a clear emphasis on getting back to our founding principles as a country. There's nothing more foundational to America than being a nation where people who are being persecuted in their home country can land to find refuge for religious freedom. That is exactly how this nation was founded 250 years ago. I hope that on or before July 4th of this year, our president will reopen the refugee pathways and then separately also asylum pathways in very smart and defined ways to save persecuted Christians and other persecuted people of faith like Grace's parents so they can find refuge in America. And I've taken more of my time than I was given, sorry. But the last thing I'll just talk about very briefly is the multilateral context. As Grace mentioned, can be very frustrating. This is a global problem, not just a US problem. Like, we're a bit frustrated with our own government and not take more action here, right? But you go into the European context, I mean, it is like, what in the world? It's so elusive to find any type of leverage point. I returned recently from meetings at the Vatican where Olivia and I went together to meet with representatives from the Holy See. I was grateful for the opportunity to tell them about the persecution of Christians in China. They say the US thinks in election cycles, the Chinese in centuries, and the Vatican in millennium. So we did not expect to see the Holy See move in a brief interaction. Data and stories must lead to effective action ultimately, but how? We have to find ways to provide not just stories and not just data, but actionable steps across the lanes and across the lines with other orgs like McCain, Article 18, CSW, IPAC, IRFPA, so many others and more. We have to coordinate our efforts together to not just share data and stories, which actually is really important that we can do that. We need to coordinate all of that together. But we need to ask for action across governments at the same time. I believe China can predict somewhat the action of the US government, although our president is unpredictable, which can be an advantage in this situation, so maybe that's good. But at the same time, I believe that we need to have coordinated action multilaterally so that China sees from the global community this is a global problem and not just a US problem. I'll close by saying this. We need the USG first, but also global leaders to accelerate the demand that every person in China is created in the image of God and is entitled to rights grounded not in the US or UN thought, but in a higher natural law created by God, which includes the freedom of religion and belief and expression and movement. Standing with Ezra Jin, Pang Yu and her husband Gao Chuanfu, with Jimmy Lai and others, and Gulshan Abbas, with the other Chinese persecuted Christians who need to find refuge and asylum in the US, is an important way we can stress the higher laws of God in the face of the CCP.
Thank you, Corey. Really appreciate that. A number of things you said, but particularly your link of what we often think about with foreign policy and national security, with political prisoner cases to domestic debates about immigration. That's something that we have not talked about this morning yet, and I think there's good reason to have that conversation because our domestic conversation about that issue is impacting our policy on helping political prisoners abroad. So I really appreciate you raising that perspective. Maybe we can talk some more about that. Olivia, over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Michael, for agreeing to moderate this. I asked Michael a couple weeks ago, hey, can you please moderate? Because I have all these random policy thoughts that I wanted to get out that I thought it would not be appropriate to be taking moderator's prerogative on. So thank you to Michael, especially. I know that your main focus is great power competition, oftentimes more focused on the security or the tech side of things, but I know it's like a personal heart issue for you to care about the human rights stuff too. So grateful for your support on that front. As I mentioned at the outset of this conference, I think we're at a very unique point in terms of diplomatic history and just history in general, where we have the convergence of political will, leverage, and opportunity all in the US's favor. And not taking advantage of this moment in time would be a huge loss for the US and for the political prisoners who are currently living behind bars today. So what I wanted to do with my time is mainly think about what can we be doing in the short term, but also what can we be doing in the long term to put us in the best possible position to be able to advocate for the release of political prisoners. So in the short term, as we're heading into this Trump-Xi summit in the coming weeks, I think there are three things that I wanted to focus on. First, there should not be a single meeting, and I mentioned this in the first panel, between US and Chinese counterparts where political prisoners are not raised by name. And not just having their names raised, but actually calling for their release and their safe return to wherever their family members are. That's a really critical distinction. It's great to raise awareness about somebody, but we need to actually be calling for their release and for their safe return. And to Corey's point, providing options for them once they're here to be able to come here and to stay here permanently. I think this is especially true for political prisoners with American citizen family members, but it is by no means limited to those. Ideally, In fact, we would raise as many political prisoners as possible. I think it's become more recent practice to just list like 3 names in meetings and to do so publicly. But actually, historically, it was quite different. We would hand over lists of hundreds of names of individuals, recognizing that all of these people's lives matter a lot. I wanted to name some of the names that we haven't raised today because there are so many others whose cases are worthy of our attention. Uyghurs like Ilham Tohti or Ek Parasat, Tibetans like the Panchen Lama, Hong Kongers like Gwyneth Ho and Lee Chak-yan, and other Christian pastors like Wang Yi. There are so many others who we can't name during this time, but their cases are equally important to us, as Michael said, as individuals, as human beings who are worthy of the time and attention of the US government and of governments all across the globe. The second is that we've spent a lot of time focused mainly on the executive branch, and I agree with you, Corey. I think without President Trump raising many of these cases by name, we're not going to see movement on them. But Congress has such an important role to play, and so I think we need to ramp up those efforts to prioritize the release of political prisoners. And Congress need to use every private and public means that they have at their disposal to raise these concerns. Members of Congress, for example, can adopt political prisoners through the Tom Lantos Defending Freedoms Project. There shouldn't be a single political prisoner who is not adopted by a member of Congress. And when they commit to that adoption, they're committing to raising them by name in public through a variety of different means. Members of Congress can write letters to the president, to the Secretary of State. They can make private calls. They can ask for visits from the Committee for the Red Cross or specific religious groups or non-religious groups who can offer relief and also provide proof of life. And one of the most important things, it's so infrequently reached for, but one of the most important things Congress can do is hold hearings, call the individuals in the US government responsible for securing political prisoner release to come and testify and to say what they are and, to be frank, what they are not doing on behalf of political prisoners. Because a lot of times these individuals need to be held accountable so that they actually take action. So that's on Congress. And then the third that I wanted to raise is definitely the multilateral efforts, as Corey was talking about. I think especially right now, there's a need to engage with people all across the globe on these issues. Folks like Pastor Jin, Gulshan Abbas, Jimmy Lai, Gao Chenfu, et cetera. These should all be household names that people are familiar with, not just here in the US, but across the globe. And looking for those multilateral mechanisms where especially allies can work together to think through the creative leverage they have at their disposal in negotiations with the Chinese. Ways that they can be publicly calling for the release, I think, is incredibly important. And in a paper that I wrote previously for Hudson, I advocated for the creation of a contact group where you would have individuals from those different allied countries who can come together, swap notes on best practices for securing political prisoner release and considering the different mechanisms that they have at their disposal. So those are kind of the short term, like we're thinking over the next year's horizon, what we can be doing. But over the long term, and I know I raised this a little bit during Q&A, over the long term, I think we should establish an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy at the U.S. Department of State. Having a special envoy of ambassador rank, Senate confirmed, somebody who has the type of gravitas that you need in a State Department position to be able to elevate these issues to the secretary level, which really is only possible if you have that ambassador rank position, is absolutely necessary. It's a oversight in the US government that does not already exist, particularly considering that political prisoner issues have been of concern for a very long time. But the fact that this doesn't exist is a gap, and this is an area where Congress can potentially act. The second, and I think this is important because it extends on the conversation that we were having earlier about hostages versus political prisoners. Under the US system, because of the creation of the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, there was the creation of a designation that the US government can give to somebody who is a hostage of being wrongfully detained. This, being able to reach for that wrongfully detained designation, gives the US government additional momentum to be able to prioritize the cases of those individuals who have been labeled as such. We don't have a parallel designation in the US government system for somebody who is a political prisoner, but in the colloquial sense, people are often referred to as arbitrarily detained. I think we need to create an entirely separate designation for political prisoners, of them being arbitrarily detained, that has a lot of those same privileges that somebody who's wrongfully detained under this VHA system could use in a political prisoner context. And I think it would also help, even just from an identification standpoint of these political prisoners often don't want to be labeled as a hostage. So being able to keep a very clear delineation, even intellectually, but also at an identity level for those individuals who feel strongly about it. Finally, I wanted to conclude my remarks kind of as a charge to everyone in the US government, but even those in civil society, for how we should consider our own role in the lead up to these summits, irregardless of the summits, and just in general at this moment in time. So many years ago, I participated in the Penn Kemble Fellowship at the National Endowment for Democracy. And as part of that fellowship, we took a visit to the Holocaust Museum. And at that time, the Holocaust Museum had a special exhibit called Americans in the Holocaust. The purpose of the exhibit was to look at how Americans did and did not respond when the Holocaust was going on. But one of the most poignant parts of that exhibit was a section where they had essentially suitcases that were representative of between 5,000 and 10,000 European Jews who had been resettled in the US. There were countless of these suitcases visually depicting those resettlements. And it stood out to me from a lot of the other, incredible exhibit in general. It doesn't unfortunately exist anymore. But the reason why so many European Jews were resettled during the Holocaust and in its aftermath was due to one single individual. He was the lone Jewish member of FDR's cabinet. His name is Henry Morgenthau, and he was the Treasury Secretary at the time. And he went to FDR and he lobbied him and said, we need to be able to offer safe haven to these European Jews. And obviously, Henry Morgenthau's bravery and decision to engage on this is commendable, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. There were people in civil society writing on the plight of the Jews. There were many articles that were featured in the exhibit that were from journalists highlighting the Holocaust. There was a role for every single person to play. I share this story because to me, it serves as a reminder that a single individual can make a huge difference when it comes to changing somebody's life and livelihood. There are over 200,000 people who are here today who have had family members since then who are here and living because of the bravery of Henry Morgenthau. And so I just want to close with that and urge that each of us has a role to play, and each of us has an opportunity to consider what role that might be. And when it comes to advocating for political prisoners in particular, this can be a matter of life and death. So thinking about how we can be brave, how we can be courageous, and how we can really focus on how we can do the best for these individual political prisoners is something I think we should all be doing right now. So I'll close with that. Thank you, Michael.
I really appreciate that conclusion. You mentioned in the first panel about your desire to bring hope into this conference, not only by bringing Michael Kovig into the conversation with a story that had a good ending, but to have a forward-looking agenda that figuring out the details of what good governance looks like with political prisoner advocacy, but also keeping our spirits up. And I think that is, it's optimistic because it actually happened. It's real. And it's a good reminder that there's a lot of people involved in any policy success. And that one person can tip the scale, but there's a whole army behind them. And that is timely. So thank you for sharing that. So many things to dig into. I'm going to take the prerogative of moderator and start the discussion, and then we'll open up in a moment. In panel number 1 and panel number 2, a word that was used a lot for good reason is leverage. When we have these conversations with the United States on one side of the table, Chinese Communist Party officials on the other side, we're angling and jockeying to find ways to advance our agenda and to essentially get them to do something they would not otherwise do on their own volition. So we've had a few different kinds of leverage discussed. You mentioned global Magnitsky sanctions and maybe just sanctions writ large, very targeted to raise the profile of particular individuals who have decision-making power here. We also talked about raising the names and demanding not just good treatment and release, but allowing them to leave, to come home, and having that be a mainstay of every single government interaction across the entire interagency with Chinese officials. I want to drill down on this question of what the Chinese Communist Party might be afraid that we would do to them. Because it's valuable to take stock of our tools that we have as the US government and as Americans with voices. Because, China has no First Amendment, so just by the fact of Americans writing and speaking boldly about this, that does have power. I want to direct the conversation toward an assessment, not only of the tools we have in our toolkit, but an assessment of what the Chinese Communist Party might fear in this domain. Whether that's sanctions, maybe we can get into unpacking that. The reason I'm asking this question is because Grace in the first panel made a really interesting point about the leverage that in some cases we think might be valuable, but in other cases could actually hurt prisoners on the ground. Like if you drill down and hit the jailer, that might actually make the situation worse than it otherwise would be. So I want to drill into this conversation of leverage and ask, just down the road, whoever wants to start asking first, please feel free. In your assessment, what do you think the Chinese Communist Party is most worried that we might do in this space?
I can start with an answer about the children of CCP party members.
Yes.
Who come to the United States or to Europe to study. And when there's enough sanctions, I was born in Colombia. Part of the reason I do this work is because I remember being people taken hostage and I lived that fear from other people. But drug dealers, when they were sanctioned by America, called it a civil death because they couldn't open bank accounts. Their children couldn't open bank accounts. They could not travel. They could not go anywhere. So sanctions allow for the family members of people who are the perpetrators of gross human rights abuses to not be able to come and study in the United States, to not go to the fancy Swiss schools, to not go to Harvard, to not give money to all these big universities in Qatar or wherever else the Chinese government is using all its influence. So we can put some personal costs on actual officials who are committing under the chain of command. You can go all the way to the top, right? Actually perpetrating and holding people wrongfully.
Do you have thoughts, Corey? Or
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think with Pedro, I agree that if we can, to Grace's point earlier, if we can find out who these people are, so that it may be some coordination with kind of our interagency law enforcement to find this out. And maybe it's readily available. I'm not as aware as Pedro might be in that area. I would just comment that not at all necessarily endorsing all the things that are happening geopolitically right now, but just kind of looking at the geopolitical context. I think we are in a position where, as Olivia pointed out earlier, not only just with rare earths, but also with the action we took in Venezuela, some of the things going on right now in the Middle East with oil and oil trade, natural gas trade. I think we show up at this conference with a decent amount of leverage in terms of the unpredictability of the last 3 months geopolitically. China likes stability. It has a long-term game plan. And we have interjected multiple interventions that have called that game plan into question. And therefore, we have leverage. I mean, I think that certain political prisoners being brought up and potentially being part of deals. I mean, we already with tariffs, that introduced an element of leverage. So I would just say that I think there can be actions taken on a more particular level, but I think geopolitically right now, vis-a-vis China, I think we do have leverage because we can also potentially quell some of the issues that we've introduced. And so, I know it's a larger question, but I would say that in 2 weeks, at this particular moment in time, if this meeting happens, we show up with a tremendous amount of leverage at the negotiating table, just sheerly based on the way that we've upended some of China's expectations of what will be happening geopolitically. Yeah.
Thank you. Olivia?
I think anytime that you're engaged in diplomacy, inherently you have leverage because you always have the option to walk away. And I think the CCP would not be particularly happy if we walked away at this moment because of the potential trade-related issues that are on the table. I think to date, the fact that the US has signaled that there aren't very many conditions under which we would walk away from the table is unwise. I actually think we should keep that somewhat ambiguous because I think the ability to walk away when the CCP clearly wants something out of these trade negotiations is a strength that we have. And it's something we should keep as an option. It might be a third rail option, but it should always be there as a possibility. I personally think that the CCP needs the US far more than we need the CCP. And I think at root, we need to play our cards in that way. And they need to know that. In an ideal dream world, we would walk away from negotiations because we would have made political prisoner release a precondition to even coming back to the negotiating table. But I suppose that ship has sailed. But that doesn't mean there aren't other intermediary ways that we can kind of play that tool. The second point of leverage that we have is what Pedro mentioned at the beginning, which is that the CCP is most fearful of the Chinese people. To me, having people speak here is powerful in and of itself. Having people speak at Pedro's conference, Congress having people come and speak, it's huge. But even more than just people speaking here, and I think this is really important, this is true of most authoritarians. Think about in North Korea, when Otto Warmbier, the previously detained UVA student in the North Korean context, almost died. The North Koreans sent him back. The health issues of these individual political prisoners are serious. Every single political prisoner has very serious health issues going on. So I think being able to tell the CCP, because Liu Xiaobo did die on their watch, and now he is a highly revered individual who received, posthumously the Nobel Peace Prize. Like, this is an individual who the CCP would love nothing more than for the world to forget. But we're not going to let the world forget about those individuals. And so I think being able to highlight that and to convey to them, look, you've got a bunch of people who are elderly, who are ill, and who you are only further exacerbating their health. Do you really want that person to die on your watch and us have to deal with the diplomatic ramifications of that? Or you could just give them to us now. I think those are points of leverage that ought to be fully utilized to the fullest extent that we possibly can. And I'm confident there's more. I agree with everything that you all said about sanctions and other tools that we have at our disposal. And I think Congress, I was so encouraged that Mike Johnson had Zeba and had Claire. I think for me that was so surprising. That kind of came out of left field, and it was such a good left field development. But we need to have more members of Congress who are boldly sticking their neck out on political prisoners' behalf and making this a high-profile diplomatic issue. Congress members have a lot more power than they think, and I think they like it when they know that they have power. So reminding them that they have that power and that they have that power for good can really shift people's future trajectory in immense ways.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Can I
Go
just
ahead. Yes,
one
of
thought
course.
about
Go
what
ahead.
Olivia said about how China's afraid of its own citizens?
Yeah.
Because all dictatorships are like this, right? They're really afraid, and they don't understand a sense of humor, for example. So humor is always very important to get back at them. And also, Grace spoke about them, churches, right? All over America and the world, there is a big growing movement in China that can become a domestic political concern. So if they don't want to your point, martyr someone, right, it gets worse. And to your point, if we don't do this right now, everything for China will get worse, right? The trade, the critical minerals. So let's make it a domestic political concern for Xi Jinping and the CCP to do these things.
So many more questions, but I'm going to table mine because I want to open up to the room to make it a broader conversation. So if you have a question, like the first panel, slip your hand up and a microphone will find its way to you. Sophie?
I love that we start with Sophie's first.
I don't want to take up too much airtime. Thank you all for these thoughts. A question and an observation. Corey, I'm glad you brought up immigration because this is hard and complicated now. You know, some of the people that we're all most concerned about and who are, you know, either in need of finding a way to get here or be brought here, we can use the prepositions of your choice. But people who are here, who are refugees or asylum seekers, who are incredibly vulnerable to TNR, but are also terrified of ICE and other immigration actions. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how we navigate at this particular time. And a couple of people have brought up sort of very broadly the multilateral context. And Olivia, what you described in terms of, you know, what sort of mechanisms would be effective, you almost perfectly described the system of the special procedures under the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, these are independent experts who have not only written about all of these cases and, you know, forwarded official interventions to Beijing about them. You know, they follow up on those cases. They then become part of a permanent record. You know, that's an incredibly important ecosystem that we do a lot of work with. And so, you know, and the U.S. is withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. So maybe we can talk a little bit too about how to work with those entities because they're very, you know, they sort of operate in a little bit of a different realm, but they're essentially doing exactly what you just described. And I think finding ways to interact with them and hold up their work, you know, make them aware of yours is, you know, that's a pretty good international partnership right there.
That's
Thanks.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that. And first of all, to the UN special procedures, you know, Grace has recently been there to talk about her father's case. I've been there about a year ago to talk about Wang Yi's case, and yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a great resource, and we need to all be utilizing the UN special procedures. I think that alongside the UN, I think that we also there's a bit of a failure point at coordinating across governments. And I realize it's very complicated because every government has their own calculation, their own national interest. But, you know, I've met with a ton of diplomats, or I mean, honestly, probably between 50 and 100 around the world about what's going on in China. And it's always I would say, it's usually a very positive interaction. They're very receptive. They want to know more. But what I wonder, I mean, I think there's a lot of organizations, there's a number of people like me that are going and having these meetings. And if we could coordinate ourselves a little bit better together and have tangible asks that are where, you know, my idea is that, and we've seen this happen before, where if you had multiple people from different governments reaching out about a very specific ask regarding a political prisoner, not just their release, but for example, there could be the child of a political prisoner that's unable to travel, unable to get out of the country. There are specific asks that can be made about medical visits. Whereas if we could have multiple counterparts mutually pinging their counterparts in Beijing, I believe that could be quite helpful. I mean, I think that, I agree, let's use the UN procedures, but I think that we could coordinate better. I will say regarding immigration, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's with a bit of fear and trepidation I even bring up this point, to be honest with you. But I believe that in general, as I stated, I'm not against what's going on from a general rule of law perspective. I think that actually could produce leverage, and I say this very carefully, I would say, that I don't know of all of the Chinese that have been detained and for what reason. And so I don't want to pretend that every Chinese person that's been detained by ICE could create a leverage point. However, I have to believe that some who have been detained under true you know, reasons of, you know, breaking the law and should not be in this country, and therefore we have a potential way to negotiate. again, I think that we have to be very circumspect and careful about who these people are and what their stories are. And so I'm not offering by any means that as a blanket way to do this. But the reality is that we have created a situation where we may have leverage, where we have actual Chinese citizens who have, they're here for the wrong reasons. So perhaps there's a way to create leverage in that way for negotiations. And I think that that's something that if the U.S. government is not considering it, then they should. But I would encourage them to be extremely careful as they consider those people's lives and their cases. But that's one opportunity. Yeah.
I think our community has like a real opportunity to highlight the immense value of refugees and immigrants. Our community, like the bedrock of a lot of our community, are people who are refugees and asylum seekers or have pending cases at the moment. And I think trying to think carefully about how we can use our voices in a way that makes clear that pathways should be made available to them, even in these difficult circumstances of what's going on in the broader corpus of immigration conversation, I think is really, really important. And Sophia, I'm glad that you're raising that about the UN, because you're right. I think that there are a lot of UN mechanisms that can be used, particularly to raise awareness over the political prisoner cases. And I always get this wrong, but I think the UN, they have a working group on arbitrary detention. So they have the ability to designate many of these people. And there are folks in this room whose family members are not designated as arbitrarily detained when clearly they are and should be under the UN system. But I don't know, when I was thinking about a contact group, I was thinking about something beyond the UN. I was thinking about it almost as like an intel sharing, like almost like Five Eyes type of operation, but much broader than Five Eyes. And I think when we think of allies, we often just think about our European allies, but there are a lot of opportunities to draw in Asian allies too into these contact groups. I just think about, for example, the US, South Korea, and Japan formed a trilateral group that did some work actually on like Uyghur forced labor issues, even though their trilateral cooperation is much broader. It's like on security and countering DPRK, countering China, countering whatever. But they have these human rights focuses within those groups. And I just wonder whether or not, even separate from the UN system, we could develop essentially an information sharing like, hey, I'm hearing this diplomatically on this political prisoner. What about this? What about that? And seeing if we can operate even in some bilateral context, but within this broader context. And maybe the UN group does do that. I'm far from an expert on the UN, but maybe they're already doing that to a certain extent. Yeah.
If anybody wants to talk about how those mechanisms work, I'm happy to be.
Yeah, I would like that.
It's very labor intensive.
Yeah.
And there's very complicated principles involved.
I know Rana does a lot of that work too.
Most of those mechanisms now require that you have the consent. Most of those mechanisms require that you have the consent of family members or lawyers to make submissions on the individual's behalf, which can further complicate things. But I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah.
I'll just say I want to hear from Grace just real quick, but going back to the immigration and refugee question, I think just fundamentally, just to state it out loud, that as we're talking about the Ezra Jins of the world, the Gatrin Fus, the Pang Yus, the Gulshan Abbases of the world, they also live here in this country. I mean, not them, but people very similar to them, the same convictions, same values, had the same job. They lived in China, they now live in the United States. Yeah. I know many of them. And so the fact is that it should be much easier to secure their safety here than it is in the Chinese prison. But it is difficult to find the path available for them to be able to secure a durable solution here. So I think that is like the lowest hanging fruit that I've ever seen, and yet we struggle to be able to move that forward. And so it's right there, and I think that it requires executive action.
Pedro.
Quick, two fingers.
Oh, sorry. Did y'all see something back there?
Grace has a question, but I think Pedro was wanting to weigh in.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
You said you were very careful about this. I'll try not to be careful, and I'll
Go for it.
I'll offer the assassins and the spies and the murderers if they get us the political prisoners back, because we've done this, right? And Vladimir Karamurza, who was exchanged for murderers and assassins, says, look, this shows the values that we each place on human life. We got human rights defenders. We got people like Vladimir Karamurza. And what did Russia want? Someone who went on a bike in the middle of daylight in Berlin and shot someone in the head and was life in prison in Germany, Krasikov. And we got Germany to exchange that guy for 16 people who were exercising their rights in Russia peacefully. So I'll offer any day of the week, all the assassins, all the spies that we're holding here, if we can get these people back. The second point, the UN Club and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. I've done a couple of these, and this is another leverage point, because this is one of the clubs that China belongs to. And specifically with the mandate holders, we know they're voluntary. They don't get paid. And China offers to pay for assistance. And then they suddenly take away their money when they don't like things they do. So it has a lot of power there, and there's a big discussion there. This was Keelan Gallagher. She said it publicly. We can talk about it later. It seems that happens. On your contact group, there is a classified group I don't know the members of in the United States government that talks about these things. It's called the Core Group. It's met at least one publicly in Montana or somewhere else. And so there is already a group. There's people who can talk to us about it, but there is the start of that. So
I love to hear that.
there we go.
I think Grace,
Hi, I have a few questions. So, Olivia, you mentioned that to have an ambassador level political prisoner person, how do we make it so? And Sophie also mentioned that it's a little bit like the special procedures. And so, how do we make it so that it actually has teeth rather than just symbolic and not really anything that actually has influence and people actually listens to them? And one of the thoughts I had and would love to hear your opinion on is like if there could be something like an automatic tariff or automatic something that gets ticked on and off based on, and it could be a range that can be negotiated by the Chinese or by like different governments coming in. If they change their behavior, then it goes down. And if they do something bad, then it goes up, and it's similarly like something that is maneuverable, and that they feel like they have some sort of a power to influence that scale. But second thing that I want to say that oftentimes with family members, I also want to we feel so alone in this fight. We're learning everything all over again every single time, and I've learned about the UN system literally this since October. But it shouldn't feel like that. It shouldn't feel like there's always this Herculean learning curve that you have to go over, and then you have to take off time for work. Some of us had to quit our jobs and all of these things. Could we have some sort of a collective family association or something that allows us to work with each other and share and ideas and share resources and such? And I don't know if anyone wants to help us organize that. That would be great. And third, in terms of leverage, another interesting thought is that there's actually a lot of bills that are in Congress that's not being pushed. For example, the transnational repression bill. I know that Francis literally talked to testified in court, and they just sent them off because there's no legal understanding of what transnational repression is still. And so many, there are ways to protect the family members in the US as well, and activists, and create potential more leverage. And I would hope that there are more ways to do that. So those are just three.
So Grace, to answer your first question about whether or not there's opportunities to create leverage within an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy, the answer is for sure yes. And one of the ways you could do this is similar to how the Trafficking in Persons report works, where you could have an actual tier system for countries based off of whether or not they were complying with minimum standards for stopping holding political prisoners. I don't know exactly, but the trafficking in persons report is like minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking in persons. You could have a similar framework, like minimum standards for ensuring just imprisonment or something along those lines. But the TIP report has had problems in the past. So Congress has had to modify over the years how it's functioned. So they have tier 1, tier 2 watch list, and then tier 3. It used to be that tier 3 was somewhat discretionary on whether or not you put a country on tier 3 and you kept them there. If a country was on tier 3, there were certain trade privileges that they didn't have access to. There were supposed to be automatic sanctions, non-humanitarian sanctions triggered non-trade sanctions. But in reality, those have not been triggered. So I think you would want to craft a mechanism based off of lessons learned from what hasn't worked in the TIP context, what hasn't worked in the Religious Freedom Report context, and make sure no double hatting of sanctions is allowed, and make sure in the trafficking in persons context, Congress went back in, amended the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and they made it so that automatically, if you had been on tier 2 watch list for I think 3 years, on the third you were automatically downgraded to tier 3, and you couldn't just like finagle whether or not somebody was on tier 3 because there was a lot of politicization of the report, particularly under the Obama administration. So I think you could do it. And I think having an annual report would be extremely helpful, not just for the public shaming aspects of it and the education levels of it, but for actually triggering diplomatic action and priority to the issue. And then secondarily, the fact that they would be somebody of ambassador rank is incredibly important. I don't think it would be worth creating this office without it being headed by somebody of ambassador rank, because they won't be able to go up to the secretary level and elevate the issues with the type of credibility that you need to have in order to do that. The third point, though, that I do want to make is that one of the reasons why I think SPIHA has been really successful is because of the people that they have hired or appointed to be in that level. If you have somebody who is sleepy and not really doing their job, it's not doing the office any justice. You need to make sure when the president is, selecting somebody for appointment and Congress is confirming them, that this is somebody who is acting, who wants to move. So, sorry, that was an extremely long answer, but hopefully helpful. And it didn't get to your second question. I don't know if maybe others can answer. I like the idea of a family association because I do think political prisoner family members need emotional support and friendship. I feel like probably more than anything. And I feel blessed secondarily to have you all as friends, because that's what makes this work worth doing, is the friendship that comes out of this. So yeah, I would just leave it there.
Right over here, next to Sophie.
Sophie, next to Sophie.
Thank you.
It's on, yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm a human rights lawyer. My law firm represents religious dissidents from China. The focus has been Falun Gong and Tibetans, but we've been approached quite often by Uyghurs. And I'm now working with Bob Fu to see what we can do for Christians. What I wanted to say is that there are Chinese lawyers in the United States who have been detained, tortured, whatnot in China, who know Chinese law quite well. So if you're interested in knowing, well, is this arbitrary arrest and detention, which I'm sure it is, I can connect you to these lawyers, and they can write memos. They can do whatever you need to do. They can advise, and they may also have ideas as to how to break through, that glass wall. Because, my experience has been that the Chinese people, by and large, don't know what's going on. I mean, there might be some who do, but that many don't, because, the propaganda. There's this really airtight propaganda system that targets each of these groups, so Christians and Catholics, who actually practice their religion are demonized. And the propaganda is pretty intense. And so to Uyghurs, and so to Tibetans, and so to Falun Gong. So the point of the propaganda is to turn the Chinese people against these groups, just as, Goebbels did in Nazi Germany, and it happens elsewhere. So I don't know if these lawyers would have an idea, but I think I agree with you that they're afraid of the Chinese people, and they have them in a bubble, an airtight bubble where they're not getting information. And if they had more information, I think that would be a helpful strategy.
And if you could pass the microphone to your left, Kelly Curry had a quick addition to add before the panel responds.
On the other side of Sophie.
That's right.
So I'm going to say just a couple things in quick succession. Visa bans under 7031B are meant to be mandatory. They are also supposed to be public, and they can extend to immediate family. And they are underutilized, but they actually could be that ratchet that can go back up and down, but only if the State Department, and they also are completely at the discretion of the Secretary of State, don't require any other part of the US government to get involved. But they are used way more selectively than they should be. And so I think that is a tool that is underutilized.
And now not publicly.
No,
So often they're being released without the name attached.
But they don't have to be. In fact, if you look at the statute has a prejudice toward transparency on these, and the use of them secretively is supposed to be limited to things like heads of state or things where it would create a problem in U.S. relations with a country. So that's who is supposed to be on the secret annex. And now they just use it for everybody, which really undermines the effectiveness of it. So Congress needs to really reassert itself again, waiting for that to happen. But that's one thing that I do want to note. The other thing that I want to say is when you talk about special procedures at the UN, and I'm also happy to help people, and as Sophie mentioned, they are resource intensive and they do require a lot of work, including a lot of evidentiary and documentary work in order to be able to bring a case before the special procedures that they take seriously and then move to act on. A lot of that work, including both the developmental and research part of it, the work that was done to build the cases, and then the advocacy work in Geneva on the ground, day to day, going in and engaging, was funded by the United States government, the Department of State's Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. And that funding is now all gone. It's gone. Or a lot of it is, maybe 90, 80% of it is gone. And I note that tomorrow, you have someone coming to the Hudson Institute named Riley Barnes. He's the assistant secretary for the bureau that used to fund these things, so it might be worth asking him what it is about this support, that even if and we continued this support the last time the United States left the Human Rights Council. I was in the Trump administration when that happened, but we maintained the support for people to continue to do this work, and then when they were bringing cases or they were doing things in Geneva, even though we were not members of the Human Rights Council and we were denouncing it out of one side of our mouths, we were also working behind the scenes to support the people who were doing this research, including especially on the China side, and pressing the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is not appointed by the Human Rights Council. That is a body, he's an officer of the General Assembly and therefore is accountable to the United States, whether they're in the Human Rights Council or not. And so it's incumbent on the United States to remain engaged on some of these other things, even if they are boycotting the Human Rights Council. There's no reason not to do other things in Geneva, and we were able to walk that line in the previous administration. So I encourage those of you who have an opportunity to bring these things up with Riley tomorrow to do that.
There's a lot for the panel to respond to here. Let's tick off a few of these that we've garnered questions for. One, involvement of Chinese nationals who are lawyers who are here in the United States for these legal cases, and then related to it, how the CCP will try to, via propaganda, turn the Chinese people against these religious groups practicing inside of China, which is not coincidentally a lot of what China's propaganda facing American citizens tries to do with dividing us against each other. So that was an interesting observation. A couple more things for the panel to respond to would be the underutilization of visa bans that Kelly just mentioned, how we can support UN special proceedings in the Human Rights Council, and how our decrease in DRL funding might make that more difficult. To the panel, I will let you guys take any of those that you find interesting.
I can sort of like kick us off if it's helpful. The cuts to DRL were completely unacceptable and will be felt tectonically, I think, for a very long time to come. So that's a great question too. I don't know that Riley will answer that, but definitely to direct to him. I agree with you on the use of visa bans. I'm curious though, and I know that we're not supposed to ask questions back, but I'm stepping out of line here. I've always perceived visa bans as a lower level kind of authority, maybe even a easier, lower hanging fruit type of thing. So it's really shocking when the administration can't even do those. But do you think that they're seen as I feel like it's almost best if they are done in tandem with a financial sanction. I know that there's benefit to doing more, or to saying okay, strategically we're gonna scale up. You stepped out of line, you get a visa ban. But if you keep staying out of line, you get a financial sanction. And if you keep staying out of line, we think about universal jurisdiction. Or there could be some sort of hierarchy developed. I'm just curious whether or not you view those as oh, this is just a little too easy, considering the gravity of you've taken somebody's family member. It's so severe. I feel bad that their kids can't go to an Ivy League institution, but I don't really feel bad. Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts.
Could we get a microphone back to Kelly?
Sorry,
No.
Like I said.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that within the State Department, there's not a formal escalation ladder, but it's certainly an informal one, and it operates in that way. And if you ask if DRL or whoever is nominating the person for a visa ban generally wants to get a public visa ban, and then you might end up with a secret. You might end up with these people on double secret probation. You ask for the public ban plus children, plus immediate family members, and you get double secret probation, no family members. I mean, this is the negotiation. We do a lot of negotiating with ourselves inside the administration in ways that undermine the intent of what Congress put these tools out there for, as well as, and they also apprehend the way that Beijing thinks about these things, and misapprehend, and I defer to Sophie on this in terms of how the Chinese position these issues, the CCP positions these issues and these kinds of human rights violations and as positional goods within their own system of negotiating with the United States. And so I think that constant misapprehension and misunderstanding about, these are, first of all, these things are put into a human rights ghetto, which is a real thing at the State Department, instead of considered part of the strategic thinking about the relationship. And that's the first problem. And when you start from that, then you just have a cascading effect of bad outcomes.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
I'll take it in a slightly different, do you have something pretty closely related there? No. Slightly different direction, actually pretty different direction. Based on your first comment about the Chinese attorneys in the United States, I think that's a really interesting point to be made. And your comment, it's almost certainly arbitrary detention, or that they're creating these charters out of thin air, which is certainly true. And I just want to say something on behalf of the Chinese pastors and Christian leaders that I work with inside China. And I think Gal's story about his father, and I thought he might have even made this point, but I'll make it, and as a result of listening to him. So Gal's father, at the age of 40-ish, finds himself with no money, yet he's been charged with fraud for up to $1 million or something like that. And it's just this idea that the man is not about money. I mean, his entire life story is about giving up everything for his faith. And yet the story the Communist Party is telling the people around him is that he's doing this for the money. And so for people, I mean, it's just such a contradictory story. I mean, that happens all over the place. All these charges that, you know, this is done. So Zion, it's like illegal use of information networks. I mean, okay. If you say that you can't ever use the internet to talk about your faith, sure, but that's something that it's doing something that every American pastor and every pastor in the free world uses the internet in some way to tell their message. So it's completely fabricated within their own system, and so I think that the Chinese pastors want and Christian leaders want their stories to be told. And I think that you can do that at the UN level. I think also leveraging media, just making sure that the propaganda that's being disseminated out to their people it's obviously untrue, but for the average Chinese person who's just kind of going about their life and not thinking, you know, they're like, oh man, well this guy was fraudulent, you know, or this guy was, you know, they were meeting illegally, you know, and so we have to find ways, and I think perhaps talking to these, you know, Chinese insiders. I mean, going back to something I said earlier, I took out, you know, I shared enough in my statement, but some thoughts on the dissident community. You know, we did a lot of work in the Cold War to galvanize dissident voices, and I find that I don't know if we have the political will to, and I don't know what's going on, obviously, on that level, but there's such an opportunity to gather the stories of these people that are in the United States and around the world, that have been persecuted or find themselves here seeking asylum, and rather than treating them as someone to be questioned, I mean, of course we need to ask the right immigration questions, but that's an opportunity for us to learn from them, to protect them first, but then also to learn from them. But I think engaging the Chinese attorneys, as we think about in China, how does that work, is something that would be something worth considering. So thanks for bringing that point up. Yeah.
On the lawyers, we definitely need your help. I remember in Russia, local lawyers who were very brave, and one of them, after he tried to defend Vladimir Kara-Murza, had to be exiled, and he spoke about it publicly. Vadim Prokhorov talked about how even in the worst dictatorships like Putin's, you still need to go to court, you still need to file all these things. And when you do UN Working Group of Arbitrary Detention petitions, you also need a full amount of, you know, what you do. So we would definitely need your help, and everyone's to create that case.
Some of my closest friends who are Chinese lawyers in China, who I met from the places here. I was telling them to be careful, and you know, because they're going back to China and so on. And I was told, no, we're princelings. You know, meaning they're children of the party leaders. You be careful. And some of them were imprisoned, and I mean, I think we were at the same meeting where one of them had aged 20 years, and just, so that's why I mentioned lawyers who are out, you know, who have escaped. Jerome Cohn, who just passed away recently, was very good at getting people out. And one of the lawyers who, I'll share the information with you, was mentored by Jerry, so he might also, you know, be helpful. But, you know, these stories are quite heartbreaking. I mean, all of the stories that we've heard today and that we haven't heard today. And I really commend all of you and the other panel, and learned a lot, quite frankly. Thank you.
I think, I'm really new kind of in the advocacy world. I've been doing it on the side of being a pastor for many years, just kind of started doing it full time. One observation I have, and to get kind of to Grace's point, so Grace's father gets arrested and suddenly she has to learn everything about what is going on. What's going on in the U.S. government? What's going on in all the branches of the U.S. government? What's going on in the advocacy world? What's going on with the leverage points inside China? And I feel like if we could make it easier on families, and I think as NGOs, if we could coordinate within ourselves, I appreciate the McCain Institute recently has really made an effort to coordinate us, and I really appreciate that. And I think I learn a lot at these meetings, and then sometimes we don't work together very well. We're all just head down. We're doing our best, and but if we could coordinate like where your strengths are, where our strengths are, I mean, it's a behemoth that we're up against, right? And so, yeah, I think the more we can do together, I think the better off.
We're getting short on time. Do we have final questions from the room? Okay, I will take the prerogative for the final question then. In the first panel, my favorite question was the simplest one, which is when you asked everyone up here, Gao, Zeba, and Grace, what the one thing that they need most. So in that same spirit, let's say this meeting between President Trump and Chairman Xi actually adheres to the schedule and happens. Let's say that the president asks and demands the release of these family members, and then the summit comes and goes, and there's no immediate change. What is the next step in that? Like, obviously, we hope there is change. In the event that it does not happen, looking forward, but also staying grounded in this present moment, what is the most pressing and urgent practical step that needs to happen not only before the summit, but post-summit?
Can I try to give a simple answer, but complicated? I think we're trying to find who at policy planning at state is controlling the agenda of these meetings so that we can make sure that it's a standing point in the agenda, not only their names, because we don't know what Trump is saying, right? We don't know if he's saying, hey, Jimmy Lai, or if he's saying, you need
he's
to...
a cool guy.
Right.
You know, we need more than he's a cool guy.
Right, exactly, exactly. So we need to, and to Olivia's point, right? She talked about hundreds. President Reagan had hundreds of names that he would present to the Soviet Union. So we don't have to be, 2 or 3 names. We can do the hundreds, and we can remember that when American power is used well, you do amazing things. President Reagan did it. President Trump has done it, releasing political prisoners in Venezuela, 80 of them, even though he didn't have to. President Biden did it when it's in Venezuela. So we can do it. It is in America's interest to free these people, and we just have to give people and maintain that bipartisan issue that they can do both. They can free all the Americans all the way around, but they can also free all political prisoners.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to offer a similar answer in that, like, not only just a state, but also with National Security Council, White House, like, we don't really know. We know that there are multiple people working on the agenda, but we don't necessarily know who to talk to and who to get a report back from. It's very difficult to recalibrate an ask based on not knowing what happened with the first ask. We might get, a bit of information like, yeah, we mentioned their names or whatnot, but to Olivia's point, like, in what way? And so it's difficult from our side to know without some type of report. Obviously, we're not going to get the full notes, but some type of report so that the fact is these meetings are happening, and they're maybe for this year, but there are these type of global engagements happening consistently and constantly. And I think the best way we can get ready for the next meeting, we can make the ask, then we have to recalibrate, but we find ourselves kind of operating in a no-knowledge zone a lot of times, making it difficult. And so I think if we had more transparency, if we had someone that we knew we could talk to, such as an ambassador of political prisoners, but until that happens, like, who do we talk to? And I find myself talking to, frankly, many people who I believe do their jobs well in the U.S. government, but I'm talking to like 15, 20, 30 people that may or may not be coordinating with each other, frankly. And so it's difficult. So I think if we could just have a place to go and talk to someone and know how to calibrate our ask, that'd be huge.
Yeah. In the event that Trump and Xi meet, we think we have 3 more potential bites at the apple. So I think with every summit, we need to be thinking about planning actually for the next summit, like literally immediately, right away. Because I think that, let's say we got everybody out in the first summit, everybody that we've raised as like the high priority folks, then we're bringing another 3 people in, and we're gonna get them out the next summit and the next summit and the next summit. So I think we need to be planning for success, ideally. But in the event that it's not successful, that we don't bring political prisoners home, President Trump needs to know that he's going to be hearing from all of us. And he needs to know he's not just going to be hearing from us, he's going to be hearing from members of Congress. So I think we have a lot of advocacy to do at the congressional level in particular to get members just awakened, alive, alert to this, because being able to get members alert to it means that at the grassroots level, constituents are familiar with it. And when a constituent says, I care about Pastor Jin, I care about Gulshan Abbas, I care about Jimmy Lai, that's when you see movement. every American needs to be demanding their member of Congress, we want to see these individuals free. And every member of Congress who hears that has a responsibility to hold hearings, to speak out, to hold press conferences where you all can come and speak, to send letters, and to be as active as possible. And we've seen, I have to do like a nice shout out. Ted Cruz has been fabulous on this. Rick Scott has been fabulous on this. The CCC folks have been really great on this. But we need more folks at the highest levels. Mike Johnson, obviously. We need more of that so that they're household names and that we can see them come home. So.
Can't think of a better note to end on other than to one more time collectively say the names of the people that we are all here talking about and the reason that we're gathered. Most immediately, Pastor Ezra Jin Mingra, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, Pastor Gao Chuanfu and his wife, Peng Yu. There's countless more, as Olivia, you mentioned. This is the tip of the iceberg. From an advocacy perspective for their family members, this is everything. And as Americans, whether we feel or realize it or not, as Michael Kovig said in the first session, we are all impacted. Because if there is one American that is being repressed and their family members are being held against their will hostage by an adversarial regime, that impacts all of our freedom, it impacts all of our security. And that ought to be something that we take with the highest regard of seriousness and deliberation. Thank you so much, Olivia, for convening, and thanks to our panelists for this wonderful discussion.
And please join us for lunch, too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.